Welcome to the ultimate bread baking marathon. If you've ever wanted to master making homemade bread, from a simple no-knead sandwich bread to a classic sourdough boule, then you're in the right place. We're gonna bake a whole host of breads today. Hi, sweet friends. If you're new here, I'm Mary from Mary's Nest and author of the Modern Pioneer Cookbook and the Modern Pioneer Pantry. And I'd like to welcome you to my kitchen. First up, let's start with the easiest bread that you will ever make, a no-knead sandwich bread. This bread is such a game changer because, as I said, it's so easy to make. It's literally foolproof. You can't go wrong. And once you make the sandwich bread, you will never buy that bread in the grocery store that comes in the plastic sleeve. I mean, you will never buy that bread again. This is going to be your new go-to sandwich bread. Well, this bread couldn't be easier to make, and it's perfect for those of you who are making the transition from a processed food kitchen to a traditional foods kitchen. And you may still be buying sandwich bread at your grocery store, but you want to start making it at home yourself. So this is the perfect bread for beginners, especially if you're not ready for sourdough and you're not ready to soak and sprout grains and start making your own sprouted flour. You just want something very simple. This is the sandwich bread for you. The ingredients are very simple, and I'm sure all of them are available at your local grocery store. What you're going to want to start with is all-purpose flour. It actually works better than bread flour in this recipe. And what I've got here is an organic, unbleached, all-purpose flour. But use whatever you can find at your grocery store. I don't want to make this difficult for you, especially if you're making the transition from a processed food kitchen to a traditional foods kitchen. If you can find organic and unbleached all-purpose flour, great. But if not, don't worry. This is a good experiment for you to learn how to make your own sandwich bread. So start with whatever you have at home or whatever you can find at your local grocery store. Now, so far I've got 5 cups of flour in there, and I'm going to add my 6th cup, and I want to show you that there's really no big deal involved. You don't have to weigh and measure anything. You just put your measuring cup into your bag of flour, your container, however you store your flour, and then just level it off with your finger. Perfect. It's very forgiving. You don't have to worry about being exact. And don't worry about writing any of this down. In the description below, there'll be a link. It'll be a direct link that'll take you right over to this recipe with the instructions that you can read online or print out. Now, the reason why I've got 6 cups of flour in this bowl is because we're going to make 2 loaves of sandwich bread. You can certainly cut this in half and make 1 loaf, but it's just as easy to make 2 at the same time, and I highly recommend it because this bread is very delicious. It's going to go very quickly, and if you do have any left over, you can use it to make French toast or croutons or breadcrumbs. These, I have videos on how to do all of these things, and I'll be sure to link to them in the iCards, and if I run out of space, I'll definitely put the links in the description below. The other ingredients that you're going to need are 1 tablespoon of salt, and this is just a fine ground sea salt, but use whatever you have. And then you're also going to need 1 tablespoon of sugar, and I'm just using a plain white sugar. It is organic, but use what you have. If you're already stocking alternative sugars in your kitchen and you have sucanat, the dried cane juice, you can certainly use that as well. And next you're going to need some melted butter. And this is just 1/4 of a stick or 4 tablespoons of melted butter. And then you're going to need 3 cups of warm water. And this can be filtered water that you have that you've just warmed gently on the stove. I know sometimes people worry about using tap water. So certainly if you have filtered water, that's great. But if all you have available to you is tap water, that's fine too. And by warm water, all I mean is water that if you took your clean finger and dipped it in there, it felt warm to you. Basically, what you're looking for is, if you have a thermometer, a food thermometer, is 110 degrees Fahrenheit. But that basically is just water that feels warm. You don't want to use hot water because at 120 degrees Fahrenheit, it can start to hurt your yeast. And then at 140 degrees Fahrenheit, it'll start to kill your yeast. But I don't want you to get very worried about this, because basically anything that just feels warm, very comfortable to the touch, is going to be perfect. Now, you can add some milk to this if you want. If you want to do half water and half milk to make the bread a little richer, you can definitely do that. I don't recommend 3 cups of milk, because that also almost makes the sandwich bread a little too rich. But you can certainly do a half, 1.5 cups of milk and 1.5 cups of water. The bottom line is you want to have a total of 3 cups of liquid. And I just want to make a mention about the melted butter. If you're trying to keep this recipe dairy-free and you're just going to use all water like I'm using here, you can substitute the butter with an oil. And you could use a coconut oil or an avocado oil or an olive oil. Try to use an oil that is less processed than some of your more highly processed vegetable oils. But just keep in mind, whatever oil you decide to use, that it may impart some flavor if it's a strongly flavored oil. So you may want to steer clear of your very lovely extra virgin olive oils that have a wonderful rich taste, because if you like that taste, which I do, in your bread, that'll be fine. But if you are using an oil, you may want to go with something that might have a little bit more of a mild flavor. Now, the final ingredient that you're going to need is yeast. So let's go over the different types of yeast that are available to you at your local grocery store. Basically, you're going to have your active dry yeast, which is very common, and also your instant yeast, which now has become a lot more common at grocery stores, because this is the yeast that is required if you're using a bread machine. But you can also use instant yeast in baking anything you want when you're baking in the oven. It's not just reserved for using in a bread machine. Now, what's the difference? Basically, with an active dry yeast, you're going to have to allow more time for your bread to rise than if you use an instant yeast. So when you use active dry yeast, you're usually going to need to add 15 to 20 minutes extra onto your rise time. And the other difference is that sometimes in instant yeast, there are additional ingredients added to help with the rise of bread and also to help extend its shelf life. And the reason for that is that when this was being developed and being suggested for use in a bread machine, you had to put this right into your bread machine with all the other ingredients without what's called proofing it or blooming it. Now, often with active dry yeast, it's recommended that you proof or bloom your yeast. And that means that you add it to warm water with a little bit of sugar and see if it starts to foam up, and then you know that it's active and ready to be used to make bread. I don't really worry about that. I know some people really believe in proofing and blooming their yeast. They feel that's very important. And now what I do is, if it's not expired and or old or close to its expiration date, if it's pretty fresh, I don't worry about it, and I'll just go ahead and throw it right in with my flour. But if it's close to the expiration date or maybe a little past the expiration date, then yes, I think that it's a good idea to add it first to your water with a little bit of sugar and see if it foams, see if it's active and ready to help rise your bread. Now, with instant yeast, you can go ahead and you can throw it right in. It's guaranteed to work, right up to its expiration date, and it's not recommended that you need to proof it or bloom it. And so you can just throw this right in with your flour and not worry about it. Now, I don't recommend using instant yeast that has been expired. One other thing I want to mention about the difference between instant yeast and active dry yeast is that often when you open these packages and look at them, the instant yeast will look like it has a slightly finer grain. I kind of find it almost a little hard to tell, but technically it does have a slightly finer grain to it. And that's also why you can add it right into your bread. It mixes with the water a little easier than the active dry yeast. But as I said, I've never had a problem throwing the active dry yeast in as well. But there's one other thing I want to mention. Instant yeast is a little more forgiving when it comes to the temperature of your water. Active dry yeast really likes the water to be around 110 degrees, and instant yeast can take it a little hotter. So if you're worried, oh, is my water too hot, or whatever the case may be, instant yeast can be a good yeast to use because it can pretty much tolerate, without any damage to it, a temperature up to 130 degrees Fahrenheit. And I also just want to mention that in addition to these little packets, if you think you're going to be baking a lot and on a regular basis, you can find yeast in a big block like this. This is instant yeast, and this is by Saf. This is a very nice instant yeast. And sometimes you might be able to find this at your grocery store. If not, you can always find it online, and I'll be sure to put a link in the description below. And this is an active dry yeast. This is in a jar. So depending if you want to go, and they also sell the instant dry yeast at my grocery store in a jar as well. So you can get the active or the instant. So it's nice to know that you can buy it in larger sizes. It kind of lowers the price a bit. And if you're going to be using it regularly and you know that it's going to still be fresh, not sitting on your shelf for years, it's worth it to buy it in a larger quantity. Well, today we'll cut one of these packets. They usually come, like in 3 packets, and sometimes they're just sold in 1 packet, the yeast. But this was in 3 packets. I've used some of it already. I made a previous video where I showed you how to make a no-knead bread in the round boule shape, and I'll be sure to link to that in the iCards and in the description below. That's very easy to make too. And so we'll go ahead, we'll use the instant yeast, and we'll just go and dump this right into our flour there. Not much fanfare. You just need 1 packet, and if you're going to use a jar or a little package like this, you're going to want 2 1/4 teaspoons of the yeast, whether you use the active or the instant. Next, we'll go ahead and add in our salt, and we'll add in our sugar, and then we'll take a whisk and we'll just mix the yeast and the sugar and the salt with the flour until we know everything's well incorporated. Next, we're going to get ready to pour in our water, but before we do that, I just want to mention the tools that you're going to need to mix your dough. Now, as I said, this is a no-knead, so there's really not much effort involved. You can use a spatula, either a silicone one like this or a wooden spatula, whatever you have. You can use a wooden spoon. If you've got one of these cute little Danish dough whisks, you can use this, but this is actually geared more for when you're doing a kneaded bread, and they work great. If you've never tried one, I highly recommend them. They're very reasonable, and you would never imagine that something like this, I think it's very funny looking, would knead bread. But it does a great job pulling it all together, especially if you don't have a stand mixer with a dough hook and all of that, or you just don't feel like taking out all that equipment. You can use one of these. I love it. But it's really overkill for a no-knead bread. You don't need to worry about it. A wooden spoon works great. And if any of you are familiar with Steve at Artisan Bread, and I'll put a link to his channel below, he's a terrific bread baker, and he just uses the handle of the spoon, and it almost acts in many ways like a dough whisk. And so that's what I'll show you that today. I think it's a wonderful trick, and it pulls the flour and the water together very quickly. So we'll go ahead and make a little well here, and we'll pour in our water. And then to that, we've got our 3 cups of water, and then to that, we'll pour in our butter, our melted butter. Alrighty, we got that all in there. And now we just take the handle of the spoon and we just start moving all around, working that water and that butter into our flour, and it's going to come together very quickly. I'll take a little video overhead so that you can see exactly what I'm doing. And as you'll see, just stir, with the handle of your wooden spoon, just keep incorporating the flour. And or your spatula, whatever you're using, just keep going around, bringing up any any flour you may see on the bottom, and it comes together very quickly. Now, yes, it's going to be a wet, sticky dough. Don't worry about that. That's exactly what you want for a no-knead bread. And then if you have a bench scrape, you can just remove whatever on your spoon. This is just a little plastic bench scrape. They're very reasonable. I'm sure you can find one in the kitchen store at your grocery store. If not, I'll put a link in the description below. But they're usually very readily available, maybe $2, $3 at most. And then take your bench scrape or your spatula, whatever you're using, and just pull down any dough that may have gotten up to the sides. And you just want to incorporate every little kind of last bit of dough and flour, and keep working that just until you incorporate it all. And that's basically it. Now that we got that all mixed up, literally took like 30 seconds. All we're going to do now is cover it. Now I'm just going to use some plastic wrap. You can also use a tea towel or like a dish towel if you have that. You may just want to put a little flour, just flour it a little bit so that as the dough rises, depending on what size bowl you're using, you don't want it to stick to your towel. And this is it. Now we're going to put it in a warm place. If you have an oven that has a bread proofing option, you can put it into that. If you just have an oven that's turned off, but you have an electric light on, you can turn the oven light on and you can put it in your oven with the oven turned off, but the electric light on. If you have an oven turned off, but with a pilot light, you can put it there, or you can just put it in a warm place, maybe near your oven, as your oven is maybe preheating, or on top of your refrigerator. Or you can just cover it a little more. As I said, if you have the plastic wrap or a towel on top, just to keep in the heat as you're letting it rise. You could put some towels on the bottom and some towels on the top to try to keep some warmth in. Another trick that you can do, as I shared when we made the boule, the no-knead boule, you can warm your bowl even before you even start this process. Wash it in real hot water, dry it well, and then put in your flour. And that will usually help retain some of the heat, and then you can wrap it in a towel and let it rise. Now, if you're using the instant yeast, you're going to want to let this rise about an hour and a half. If you're using the active yeast, you're going to want to add 15 to 20 minutes to your rise time. Now, basically what you're looking for is for it to double in size. Now, I know that can be very intimidating to people, that terminology, when you're a new baker, because a new bread baker, you may be looking at it and saying, is it double? Is it not double? Should I let it go longer? And then you worry, oh my gosh, is it going to overrise? And what about the finger poke test? And all these different things. I don't want you to worry about any of that. A little under or overrise in the bottom, and the bottom line is in the end, it's going to make about a 10% difference in your bread. And if you're not a professional baker, I don't think you're going to really notice. And I don't think anybody in your family or your friends is going to notice. All they're going to notice is you made fresh bread, homemade. So just plan on an hour and a half. And then a little longer, 15 to 20 minutes, an hour and 45 minutes, or an hour and 50 minutes if you use the active yeast. And it's going to be fine at that point. Well, this rose beautifully after about an hour and a half. And I'll take an overhead picture, and I'll also take a picture from the side so that you can see exactly what this looks like. And then you'll notice that when you take your bowl and bring it over to your counter to get ready to put into your loaf pans, if you give the bowl a shake, and I'll put a little video so you can see this, it's going to shake like a bowl of Jell-O. That's exactly what it's going to look like. And that's exactly what you're looking for. Now what you're going to need are 2 loaf pans, and these are just plain old regular loaf pans. They're approximately maybe 8.5 by about 4.5 or so, and you can use metal loaf pans, you can use glass loaf pans, whatever you have is fine. What's most important though is that you want to grease them very well. So if you're using butter, grease them very well with butter. If you're using some type of oil that you've maybe used in your recipe because you want to keep things dairy-free, grease it very well with oil. This is a very important step because by greasing your pan very well is what's going to keep the exterior crust soft. And then I'll show you another little trick when we take the bread out of the oven after we've baked it to how to keep the top real soft too. But we'll get to that after we bake them. Now, the next thing that we need to do is deflate this dough and divide it into 2 equal portions. Now, it is wet and sticky, and we're not going to be using any additional flour. So you can do this with your hands. If you do, you may want to give them a good greasing. We're going to have to grease them as it is to get them into their pans. If you've got your bench scrape, you can do that. If you've got a wooden spoon, or I've got like a wooden spatula, this works real well to get it down off the sides. But basically what we're going to do is just start to deflate it, and we're going to push it into the center and get it to form into a ball. And as you're deflating this and just pulling it away from the sides, you're going to just pull it and kind of pull it over itself. And I'll take a video overhead so you can see what I'm doing. But I'm basically just kind of pulling it over itself, just as we pull it away from the sides, and getting it to kind of form into a ball best we can. It's not really going to be a ball per se, but you just kind of want to get as much as you can away from the sides and get the bread basically down, deflated, and in the middle of your bowl. Now, once you've got it pretty much deflated and you've turned it over on itself a few times, take a little butter or whatever oil that you may have used, and give your hands, just rub the butter right in your hands and cover your hands really well so that they're nice and greasy. This is fun. Now, with your greased hands, you're just going to get in here and you're basically going to separate this evenly, best you can, into 2 pieces. And as you work to separate these into basically 2 individual loaves, they will kind of fall back into one another. However, even after you do this, and I'm going to overlay a video so that you can see when you stop doing it, they will, it's very greasy, there will be a line down the middle. And so you'll know exactly, now that you've divided it into 2 loaves, to just get in there and lift out the 1/2. Now, if you have a bench scrape like this, it's a great time to use it. If not, you can certainly use your wooden spoon. But what's going to come in most handy in this job is going to be your hands. So you'll see. So just try to scoop out about half. Don't worry, you're going to be adding to this. Just do the best you can. Oh my goodness, look at that. And then we're just going to dump that right into our pan. Nothing special, nothing fancy. We're just going to get in there and get the rest of what we left behind for that half, and again, just dump it right into your pan. Then once you get half the dough in your pan, just give it a good little shake to kind of fill all the nooks and crannies, and it's going to be perfect. So after you give it a shake to kind of get everything to level out, if you find that there's still maybe a little nook or cranny that you don't feel the dough's expanded enough into, you can get in there with your greased hands and you can just pat it down a bit and move it around a bit to fill any area or to flatten it a little, even it out, whatever you want to do. And that's it. And now we'll get ready to fill our next bread pan. Alrighty, well now we've got both loaves of dough in our loaf pans, and we want to let this rise for another 40 to 45 minutes. If you're using the active dry yeast, you may need a little more time, but you want to leave them uncovered, but in a nice, warm, cozy place. And what you're going to be looking for is a rise that is more or less going to be close. You know, there may be some doming, but it will be relatively close to the edge of the pan. And then we'll be ready to bake them. And as you're getting closer to that 40 to 45 minute rise, go ahead and preheat your oven to 375 degrees Fahrenheit and have your oven rack in the middle, because these are going to go on the middle rack in that 375 degree Fahrenheit oven. Well, I kept these in a nice, warm, cozy spot, and if you notice, they're just crowning like the rim of the pan. I took a photograph from the sides and I'll overlay it so that you can see. They don't have like a big dome like that. You're not looking for that. It's just when they just start to slightly dome up over the side of the pan. I did my best dividing the dough up. I think there was a little more in this one, but this one is perfect. This is what you're looking for. Just a slight dome right at the rim. And you know, depending on what time of year it is and what the temperature in your kitchen is, you know, as I said, it can be about 40 minutes, but it can also be less. So, you know, if say you're doing this in the summer, just keep an eye on it because you just don't want them to get too puffed up. Now we're going to go ahead and pop them into our 375-degree oven, middle rack, and we're going to let them bake about 40 to 45 minutes until they're golden brown on top. Well, these were in the oven about 40 minutes and they look wonderful. And what you're looking for is to get this nice golden brown on top, and you want them to sound, hear that? They sound hard on top. However, what we're going to do to make them nice and soft is we're going to take some butter and we're just going to put it in a little bit of a paper towel here to hold it. And then while they're nice and hot right out of the oven, we're just going to start rubbing butter on top. And this is going to help really make this top nice and soft. Well, I've rubbed butter over both of them, and that'll sink in, and then as it cools, it'll help soften up that crust, making it a little more similar to the sandwich bread that you buy at the grocery store. But look at how beautiful these look, all shiny with that butter melting on top of them. Well, now what we're going to do is we're going to take them out of their pans, and we're going to put them on a cooling rack and let them cool for a bit. Well, what I'm going to do is, they're cooling off a little bit, is just flip these right out. Look at this. Oh, they're glorious. Look at this beautiful bottom. Oh, looks so nice. Oh, it's quite hot. And I'm just going to put it over here on the cooling rack, and then I'll do the same thing with this one. Well, these are still quite warm, but I think we're just going to have to slice into them and see how they came. So let's give a nice slice here. I've got a serrated knife. Oh gosh, it cuts like butter. Oh my goodness, look at this glorious piece of bread. Look at that. I'll take a close-up shot so that you can see it. It's gorgeous. Well, this came beautiful, and it's so soft. I cut it nice and thick, almost like a Texas toast. But let's give it a taste and see how it is. Okay, it's a little warm. I should probably have waited, but look at that. And the crust is nice and soft now. Delicious. You're going to love this bread. It's the perfect homemade sandwich bread. It's so soft and it just melts in your mouth. So you saw how easy it is to make sandwich bread. And that recipe is based on an old-fashioned batter bread. And so now, next up, we're going to make a batter bread. And what's nice about this particular bread is that you can make this bread any way you want. You can add different things to it to change it up, but the bottom line is you always will know how to make a basic batter bread. And again, this is so easy, just like the sandwich bread, that it is really going to be hard for you to ever go back to, I think, pretty much buying any bread at the grocery store. Well, you're going to love making this bread because not only is it easy, it makes a wonderful sandwich bread and also really great toast. Now, the first thing that you're going to want to do is get a loaf pan. I've got a metal one here. Metal or glass is fine, either or. And you want to grease it really well. I've greased mine with butter. And my loaf pan is approximately 5 inches by 9 inches, the interior measurement. But if yours is a little bigger or a little smaller, don't worry, it'll work out fine. The ingredients that you're going to need are 3 cups of flour. And you can use all-purpose flour or you can use bread flour. Next, you're going to need 1.5 cups of warm liquid. I'm using whole milk because it makes for a really nice texture in the bread, but you can certainly use skim or non-fat milk or anything in between, or you can even use water. Now, I've not tried making this with some of the alternative milks like oat milk and almond milk and whatnot, but I think they might work, so it'd be worth experimenting. You're also going to need 2¼ teaspoons of yeast. Now, if you have the little package of yeast, that's the exact amount that you need. If you're measuring it out from a larger container, then it's 2¼ teaspoons. And you can use active dry yeast or instant yeast. Either will work. You're also going to need a tablespoon of sugar. I'm just using a plain white sugar. It's organic and unbleached. But if you're farther along on your journey from a processed foods kitchen to a traditional foods kitchen, and you've already incorporated using sucanat as your main sugar, which simply stands for sugar cane natural, it's just dried cane juice, dried sugar cane juice, you can certainly use that. But for beginners, if what you've got is white sugar, that's perfectly fine, just 1 tablespoon. And then you're also going to need 1.5 teaspoons of salt, and I'm just using a fine ground sea salt. And you're also going to need 3 tablespoons of softened butter. Now for your warm liquid, you want it to be warm enough that if you put your finger in, a clean finger, it would just feel like warm bath water. You don't want it to be super hot. And if you do have a thermometer and you want to test the actual temperature of your water, you would want it to be 110 degrees Fahrenheit if you're using active dry yeast. If you're using instant dry yeast, which is a little forgiving on the temperature, you can have your water as warm as 130 degrees Fahrenheit. But really, if you can just put a clean finger in there and it feels like warm bath water, you're all set. So what we're going to do is go ahead and put our warm milk into our bowl. And then we're going to go ahead and add in our butter. And you want your butter to be nice and soft. Mine was even starting to melt a little bit. It was near the stove. And then you want to go ahead and just sprinkle in your sugar. And then just give this a good little whisk around. It'll help the butter start to melt in the warm milk. Well, that butter is melted nicely. And now we're just going to go ahead and we're going to take our yeast and we're just going to sprinkle it right on top of our warm milk mixture. And we're just going to give that about a minute to just kind of sit there and start to dissolve. Well, my yeast is dissolved, and next I'm going to take my salt and I'm just going to go ahead and sprinkle that into my flour and just mix it around. Now I'm going to go ahead and take about 2/3 of this flour. I'm just going to leave about 1/3 behind to start. And then you can use a wooden spoon, or if you've got one of these handy-dandy dough whisks, this works great too. And all you're going to do is just start incorporating the flour into your liquid. And all you want to do is just keep mixing this around until you've got all the flour moistened. It's going to be a very wet, sticky dough. It's basically a batter. And that's where the name batter bread comes from, because it's not like a traditional dough that's drier and that you're going to have to knead. This is no knead. Now I'm just going to go ahead and add in the rest of my flour. And then I'll just continue to mix this to just get the rest of that flour incorporated. Now when you're done mixing this, it's just going to be a wet, shaggy dough. It's not going to clean the bowl like a lot of other doughs do, but that's perfect. This is exactly the way it should be. The next thing you want to do is dampen your hands with some water. We don't want to add any extra flour. And we're going to go ahead and pick up our dough, and it's going to be very sticky. And then we're just going to go ahead and we're going to put this right into our baking pan. So we've got our batter in the pan. Now we just want to wet our hands and wet our fingers, and we just want to smooth this out just so that we get it fitted into the pan. And just want to do this with wet hands so that the dough won't stick to us and we're not adding any additional flour. Now once you get this all flattened out in the pan, what I like to do is take a knife and just score it right down the middle. And I'm just going to put my knife in about 1 inch deep, and I'm just going to score it like this right down the middle. Now that I've got it all flattened down and scored down the middle, I'm just going to cover this with a piece of parchment paper. You can use anything you want. This I know won't stick, so it works well. I'm going to just tuck it away in a warm place, and I'm going to check on it in about 30 minutes. You're probably going to need anywhere from 30 to 45 minutes to get it to rise, and all you're looking for is for it to rise right up to the edge of your pan, not above. Well, I let this rise for 30 minutes in a warm place, and it actually even rose a little more than it needed to. It's getting a little rounded on top, but you don't need that at all. All you're going to look for is to just get it right up to the rim. So I got a little distracted, but this is going to be fine. So don't worry if you let it go a little longer and it gets a little above the rim, it's still going to be fine. Now what we're going to do is go ahead and put this in a 375-degree Fahrenheit oven, and we're going to put it on the middle rack. Now we're going to let that bake for about 45 minutes, but everybody's oven is different. So at about 35 minutes, just check it and see how it's coming along. And if you feel it's a little over browning on top, you can easily tent it and continue to let it bake if it's still not thoroughly baked. Well, I just took my bread out of the oven and it's looking glorious. Now, if you like a soft crust, this has got a nice little bit of a crisp to it. If you like it real soft, right at this time when it's nice and hot and you've just taken it out of the oven, just rub the top with some butter, and that'll keep it nicer. It'll make it nice and soft. Now, I also tented my bread when it was browning in the oven. I have a very small oven, and so I do need to be careful that my bread doesn't over brown. So it may depend on the size oven you have, but as I said, keep an eye on it. If it looks like it might be potentially over browning after the full 45 minutes of baking, you can always go ahead and tent it. Now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take it out of the pan. I don't want to leave it in the pan too long. Oh, it looks glorious. And let's just give it a tap here. Yeah, see? Can you hear that? It'll sound hollow when you tap it, and you'll know that it's done. And now I'm just going to put it down here to cool a bit. And we'll just give it a few minutes to cool, and then we'll slice it and see how it looks inside. Well, this is still quite warm, but it's hard to resist warm bread. So let's go ahead and just start slicing this, and we'll see how it came out. Oh, it just slices beautifully. Oh, look at this glorious bread. Look at that. I think you're just going to love this bread. And it makes amazing toast. You toast up a slice of this for breakfast with butter and jam. Oh, you can't go wrong. Alrighty, let's give it a taste. Oh, look at this. It's just beautiful. Mmm. Mmm. So soft. So tasty. Mmm. How you're going to enjoy this. Well, now that you've got an easy sandwich bread and a batter bread recipe under your belt, it's time to learn how to make homemade bread step by step. We're going to go old school, but I feel it's important that you know how to do this. Well, even though we've made a number of no-knead breads together, many of you have written to me either in comments or via email asking me to show you how to make a basic bread with yeast that you knead by hand and that gets a beautiful domed rise to it. And that's what we're going to do today. Well, let's go over the ingredients. They're very basic, and I'm sure you have most of these in your pantry. The first thing that you're going to need is some flour. It can be all-purpose flour or it can be bread flour. Either will work, and you're going to want 3 cups. Now, for those of you who are making the transition from a processed foods kitchen to a traditional foods kitchen, and you've started incorporating whole grains into your baking, you can use some whole grain flour in this recipe. You can do half all-purpose flour or half bread flour and then half whole grain flour. You can use traditional, the modern day whole wheat. You could use the ancient grains like einkorn or spelt. Any will work. But if you want to go with 100% whole grain, the bread will be a little denser. So I recommend that if you do want to incorporate whole grains, that you start with half all-purpose or half bread flour and half your whole grain flour. Next, You're going to need 1 tablespoon of sugar. This is just a plain white sugar. It is organic and it's unbleached, but you can use whatever you have on hand. And again, if you're in the process of making that transition from a processed foods kitchen to a traditional foods kitchen, and you have the whole cane, the dried cane juice, the whole sugar, normally called sucanat, you can definitely use that too. And then you're going to want a teaspoon of salt, a rounded teaspoon, so you're going to be a little generous with the salt. Next, you're going to need your liquid, and you're going to need a total of 1 1/4 cups of liquid. Today, I'm going to use a 1/2 cup of milk, and then I'm going to have 3/4 cup of warm water in here, for a total, as I said, of 1 1/4 cups. Now, if you want to do all milk, you can. If you want to do all water, you can. If you want to use I'm using whole milk. If you want to use a different type of milk, low fat or fat free, you can do that. You can use alternative milks. Anything will work. It's just that you're going to need 1 1/4 cups. And then next, you're going to need 3 tablespoons of butter. And you want to have that butter softened at room temperature. And finally, you're going to need some yeast. And I've just got here a package of active dry yeast. Now, in a previous video, I went over a lot of explanation about the different types of yeast that there are, and I'll be sure to link to that video if you want, and I'll put the timestamp where I go into that discussion if you'd like to learn more about yeast. But as I said, today I'm going to use active dry yeast. Now, if you don't have active dry yeast and you have something called instant yeast, you can use that as well. The only there's some differences to it, but the basic difference is that instant yeast will allow your dough to rise a little faster than the active dry, but either can work in this recipe. Now make sure that your milk is at room temperature, and then if you're using milk, and if you're just using water, you want to have nice warm water. You want it to be about 110 degrees Fahrenheit. Now if you don't have a thermometer, don't worry. If you put a clean finger in here and it feels like warm bath water, that's the perfect temperature. And then just go ahead and add that right in with your milk. Next, we'll go ahead and sprinkle our sugar right in. And then we'll go ahead and open our package of yeast and sprinkle that on top. Now, if you're not using packaged yeast like this and you have a little jar of yeast or a little, sometimes they're sold in little blocks of yeast, then you're going to want 2 1/4 teaspoons of yeast. So whether you're using the instant yeast or the active dry yeast, you're going to want 2 1/4 teaspoons. And so we'll just go ahead and sprinkle that right into our liquid. Then I'm just going to take a little whisk and I'm just going to give this a little stir around to incorporate the yeast, the sugar, and the liquid all together. Next, we're going to set this aside and just let it froth up a bit. It's going to take about 5 minutes. Next, I'm going to take my salt and just sprinkle this over my flour, and I'm just going to whisk this to incorporate it well throughout the flour. So after about 5 minutes, you'll get a real frothy top on top of your liquid to which you've added your yeast. And then you just want to take your flour in which you've mixed the salt really well, just make a little well in the middle, nothing fancy, and then go ahead and pour in your yeast, or your yeast mixture. The next thing all you want to do is just mix all of this together. You can use a wooden spoon. If you've got a Danish dough whisk like this, you can use that. It looks funny, but it works great. Or if you're a fan of artisan bread with Steve, like I am, you'll know that he uses just the handle of his wooden spoon. And he says that it's very similar to using a Danish dough whisk. So there's something to that too. So I'm just going to go ahead and start incorporating all of this flour with my liquid, and then we'll move on to the next step. Once you've done your best mixing everything together with your wooden spoon or your dough whisk, whatever you're using, and it's come together as much as it's going to come together with using those tools, the next thing that you want to do is go into the bowl with your clean hands and start to bring all of your dough together so that it forms a ball. And now I'll start doing that, and I'll show you, I'll overlay a video so that you can see exactly what I'm doing as I go around the bowl and try to bring in all those little pieces of flour and water or liquid that I've not been able to get 100% incorporated just using the spoon. And basically what you're doing is just more or less using the dough ball to go all around your bowl and clean your bowl. And then once we get pretty much everything off the sides and the bottom, and we've got it all incorporated into our dough ball, we'll transfer it onto the board and we'll get ready to knead it. Now, if your dough feels exceptionally dry, you can wet your hands and use wet hands as you're kneading your dough. But resist the urge to add too much water other than what you put on your hands, because as you knead your dough, it is going to become softer, it's going to become better, it's going to come together. So just give it a little time. And the same is true as if you think that the dough is very wet. You can flour your hands and use whatever the flour is on your hands to work your dough, but try not to add too much flour. Now, granted, weather conditions in your kitchen, so on and so forth, can affect the consistency of your dough. So if you do feel that it is a little dry or it is a little wet, just make those minor adjustments. And as you knead your dough, if you start to see it coming together and coming together nicely, you know that you don't need to add any more liquid or any more flour. Now, if you find that your dough sticks to your board, because we're not going to flour the board at this stage, we really want to try to see if all of the ingredients we used were sufficient to create the nice dough that we want. So if your dough sticks to your board a little bit, just use a bench scrape. This is just a very inexpensive plastic bench scrape to scrape your dough off your board and add it back in to your dough ball. And if you don't have a bench scrape, don't worry, you can use a spatula. It works very well. Now basically, to knead our dough, all we're going to do is take the palm of our hand and push it down into the dough. And then we're going to fold over part and then just turn it like a quarter of the way, press it down again, fold it again, turn it a little, press it down again. It's really, I've even got a little sticking to me and sticking to my board here. So you'll see I'll just scrape that right up and put that on. But as you see, it's not an exact science, so don't worry about it. Just keep pushing and folding and turning. And after a few minutes, you're going to start seeing this coming together nicely. Now, if you're doing this by hand, we're going to have to knead this about 8 to 10 minutes. If you're using a stand mixer, although definitely not required, it's probably only going to take about 2 to 3 minutes. So after hand kneading this for about 7 to 8 minutes, somewhere in there, you want to start incorporating your butter. And I've got 3 tablespoons of butter, and it's softened. And I'm just going to try to start incorporating about a tablespoon at a time. And all I'm going to do is just put a piece on top like that, best I can, fold it over, and start to work it in. Now you may be wondering, why are we incorporating the butter now? Why can't we just add a little melted butter to our liquid with our yeast and pour that in and go from there? And that's an excellent question. The reason is, as you're kneading the dough for the bulk of the time, 7 to 8 minutes, as you're maybe working up to that between 8 and 10 minutes sweet spot when we'll know that the dough is perfectly kneaded, if you put the butter in at the beginning, it can be very sticky. And that's what I wanted to show you here. As I was kneading in the butter, you'll see, and I'll take a picture and overlay it, that more dough is sticking to the board. And what happens, especially if you're a new baker having to knead dough for 8 minutes and it's constantly sticking, you get the temptation to add extra flour, and that can sometimes throw off the recipe. Whereas if you knead the butter in towards the end, yes, it's a little bit of a sticky wicket of a mess, but you're not kneading it as long. And then you can just take your bench scrape or your spatula and just get all those little bits. It's like butter and a little dough in there. and scrape it off your board, consolidate it back into your dough ball, and because you've been kneading it for a minute or two, working in that butter, it's a lot easier to work with now, and it's not sticking. Well, after you've kneaded this for somewhere between 8 to 10 minutes and you've got all your butter incorporated and it's no longer sticking to your board, now what you can do to see if it is kneaded sufficiently, you can do something called the window pane test. And you just take off maybe about a golf-sized ball of the dough and roll it around in your hand, and then you just want to start pressing it out as thin as you can. And then you're going to start stretching it. And what you want to do is you want to stretch it gently. You don't want to pull it real hard, but just gently till you get to the point where it's somewhat translucent. And if you hold it up to the light, you can see some light coming through it. But as you're pulling it apart and it doesn't rip as you're trying to get it translucent, that means that you've kneaded it enough. But I also want to let you in on a little secret. A little under kneading, a little over kneading, it doesn't make a big difference in the bread, maybe 10%. And everybody's just going to be happy that you baked homemade bread. It's going to come out fine. So if you've kneaded it somewhere between 8-10 minutes, you've kneaded it enough. Once you feel it's sufficiently kneaded, you want to take your bowl. You can use the same bowl that you mixed your dough in, and you just want to put in a little bit of olive oil. You don't need too much, maybe somewhere between a teaspoon and a tablespoon. Then we're going to put our dough ball in here. We're going to just swizzle it around and turn it upside down. Make sure that we get it all well greased. Next, you want to take some cling wrap or a dish towel, whatever you have, and I'm just going to use this cling wrap to cover my bowl. If you use a dish towel, you'll want to dust it with a little flour, or alternatively, if you have a damp dish towel, you can use that too. You just want to make sure that the dish towel won't stick to your dough. Now we want to put this in a warm place to rise, and we want it to double in size, and it's going to take about an hour to an hour and a half. Now for a warm place, that might be on top of your refrigerator or maybe in your oven, but with the oven turned off, but the electric light on or the pilot light on. Just some warm, cozy place that is free of drafts. And you'll know that it's risen to the right amount when you put your finger into the dough. It's called the finger poke test, and you just go right up to about the nail bed. You don't have to really stick it in deep. Just stick it in, and if it springs right back, you know that you have to recover it and let it rise another 5 or 10 minutes and check it again. If you put your finger in and it stays in, or it starts to fill in very, very slowly, then you know that your bread has risen enough. But again, like with the window pane test, don't worry too much about the finger poke test. Chances are, if you let this rise for an hour or an hour and a half, and it looks like it's doubled in size to you, that's perfect. If you check it at an hour and you're not sure, just let it go an hour and 15 minutes, an hour and a half, whatever the case may be, it's going to be fine. Well, I let this dough rise for about an hour and a half, and it looks very good. Now, what I'll show you, what I'm talking about with the finger poke test, we're going to put our finger into the dough just up to the nail bed, and if it stays indented, it's risen enough. So our indentation stayed in. We know our dough is risen enough. Now we want to make sure that we have a loaf pan. This is about a 9 by 5, 9 inches by 5 inches approximately, and it's well buttered. So just take care of that and let that be, put that aside. Next, what we're going to do is take a little flour, and now is the time where we're going to flour our board just lightly. And then we're going to roll out our dough, and I'll show you how to roll it up and to get it into the bread pan or the loaf pan. So we'll just go ahead and punch this down just like that and scoop it out as we go. And thanks to that olive oil, it's not going to stick to your bowl. And now what we want to do is just work this around a little bit. Just get a little flour underneath so nothing sticks. And then we're going to roll this out. So I'm just going to get a little more flour. I'm going to flour my rolling pin here. And we're just going to start rolling this out into a rectangle. And we want it to be about the length of our loaf pan, or bread pan, whatever you want to call it. And if as you're rolling it out, it tends to kind of spring back on you, don't worry, let it rest a few minutes and try again. It should roll out fine. And then once you get it rolled out to where it's about the length of your pan, it doesn't have to be exact, don't worry, you're just going to start rolling it just like a little jelly roll. And you just want to do it gently but tightly. So just roll your dough up the way I'll show you. I'll overlay a little video, and you want to be a little firm as you tuck in, roll and tuck a little, roll and tuck a little, so that it stays together nicely. And then with your hand, just be a little firm in terms of, I should say, firm but gentle. I don't know if that sounds kind of funny, but you don't want to put too much pressure on it, but you do want to make sure that as you roll and you tuck it in a little, that it does stay secure. And then you just want to make sure that you've got the seam on the bottom, and then just tuck in your sides and pinch them together a little, and then just go ahead and plop this right down into your pan. Now what you want to do is let this bread rise for about 45 minutes, and it'll be nicely domed. And what you want to do is cover this with maybe a damp dish towel or a well-floured dish towel. You don't want anything to stick to the top of this dough, and you don't need to put any butter or oil at this time, so you don't want to be using like a plastic wrap rubbed with oil or anything like that. You want just a damp dish towel or a floured dish towel. However, those of you who are familiar with Artisan Bread with Steve will recognize this. You can just take another loaf pan and put it right on top like this, and then put this whole thing in a warm, cozy place to let it rise. You may have seen also too, if you watch Joshua Weissman, he does a lot of baking as well. And I think this is such a very clever trick, because you just put it on top. Now we're not going to bake it like sometimes they do with some of their no-kneads and whatnot, the poor man's Dutch oven, as Steve calls it. But we're just going to use this to rise our bread. So now all we need to do is find a warm place like we did before and let this rise for about 45 minutes. Now, while that bread is rising, go ahead and preheat your oven to 450 degrees Fahrenheit so that we can get it nice and hot. Now, we're not going to bake the bread at 450 degrees Fahrenheit. We're going to bake it at 350 degrees Fahrenheit. So once we put the bread in, we're going to turn the oven down. But it's nice to be able to put our bread into that nice, real hot oven and give it that little boost. What did they say? Oven spring, to help it get a nice rise to it. Now, I also want to talk to you about the rack in the oven and where to place it before you even preheat the oven. I have a very small oven, so I put the rack on the lower third rung of my oven. If you have a very large oven, you might be able to put the rack right in the middle rung. The reason I put mine on the lower third is because, with it being a small oven, if I put my rack on the middle rung, the bread is very close almost to the top of the oven, and it can over brown. So you may want to look at what size oven you have and think about how close the bread will be to the top heating element. If it looks like it might be within 3 or 4 inches of the top heating element, you may want to put your rack in the lower third of your oven and bake your bread down on a little lower. But if for any reason during the baking process you find your bread over browning but it's not done, then you can always tent it with a little aluminum foil and allow it to continue to bake and keep the top from over browning. But often if you bake in the lower third of your oven, that's not a problem. Well, I let this rise for about 45 minutes, and I think it's looking terrific. So I'm going to get ready to go ahead and put this into my oven. It's been preheated at 450 degrees Fahrenheit with the shelf, the rack on the lower third of the oven. And now I'm going to put this in the oven and I'm going to lower the heat to 350 degrees Fahrenheit. And I'm going to let this bake about 35 or 40 minutes. Well, look at this glorious bread. I just took it out of the oven. It was in about 40 minutes. Now I'm just going to let the pan cool a tiny little bit, and then I'm going to tip it over and put it on the cooling rack to cool completely. Now I just want to show you the top crust has a nice crust to it. Hear that? Now, if for any reason you want this to be very soft and not have that little bit of crunch to it, you can right now, while it's hot, take some butter and just rub the butter on top of the crust, and that'll soften it tremendously. Well, this is a little easier to handle, so I'm going to take this out. I think it should come right out because we really, oh yeah, look at that, beautiful. We really buttered that pan. And then look at this glorious loaf of bread. Well, I let this cool a little bit, but it's still quite warm. But who can resist warm homemade bread? So we're just going to have to go ahead and slice into this. Oh, this just, oh, it has such a nice feel to it. I think you're going to love this bread. Listen to that. Oh, glorious. Got to slice some Texas toast size slices. Oh, look at this beautiful bread. Oh, I think you're going to just be so pleased. I'll take some overhead shots so that you can, or close-up shots, so that you can really see how this came out inside. Oh, it's just beautiful. I'm going to slice another slice, and we'll get a little bit more of a look, a little deeper into this bread, and I'll take some more close-up shots. Oh, look at this. Oh, it's still quite warm, but look at how beautiful this slice of bread came. This is just so light and tender. I think you're going to really love this. Well, let's give it a taste. I'm going to get some of this crust. Oh, delicious. Now I want to share with you how to make one of those beautiful artisan boules that you often see at the bakery. They're actually a lot easier to make than you can imagine. And once you make this bread, you're going to make it time and time again, and it's always going to come out great. So let's get you started making a beautiful bakery-like artisan boule. You're just going to need 4 ingredients to make this bread. The first is going to be flour. You can use all-purpose flour or you can use bread flour. Either one will work just fine, and you're going to need 3 cups. Next, you're going to need some yeast, just plain old packaged yeast from your local grocery store. And the type of yeast you need, again, very flexible. If you've got active yeast, that'll work just fine. If you've got instant yeast, that'll work too. They're really not that different. The only difference that probably is the most common thing to notice when you're reading the package is that active yeast generally likes water that's around 110 degrees Fahrenheit, and instant yeast is a little more forgiving and can tolerate up to 130 degrees Fahrenheit. But you know what? In this recipe, it doesn't matter. Because the bottom line is, if you want to use cold water for this recipe, you can. If you want to use lukewarm water for this recipe, you can. And if you want to use water that is up to 130 degrees Fahrenheit and you're using instant yeast, you can use that too. And what exactly does 130 degree Fahrenheit feel like? It's kind of like bath water. But again, it doesn't matter. And the chances of you using boiling water is very unlikely. And that's something you do want to avoid, because boiling water does have the potential to kill your yeast. However, the likelihood of getting boiling water out of your kitchen sink faucet is very unlikely. But know that if you're worried about this in one way or the other, just use cold water. Now, how much yeast you're going to use will depend on how long you want to leave your dough to rise. That's what I meant earlier by this being on your schedule, not the dough or the bread schedule. Now, for this bread recipe, we're going to be using somewhere between a 1/4 teaspoon of yeast or a 1/2 teaspoon of yeast. And how much we use is going to be based on how quickly we want to be able to bake our bread. If you want to mix this dough in the morning and bake it for dinner that same day, you're probably going to want to use a 1/2 teaspoon of yeast. The same would be true if you want to mix your dough at night and bake your bread in the morning. You'll want to use a 1/2 teaspoon of yeast. If, on the other hand, you want to let your dough just sit longer than a day's worth of time, say approximately 8 hours, you then only need to use a 1/4 teaspoon of yeast. And now, why would you want your dough to sit longer, and why would you just want to use a 1/4 teaspoon of yeast? Let's talk about that. The less yeast you use and the longer you allow your dough to rise and, in essence, ferment like a sourdough, the tastier your dough is going to be and the more holes it's going to have. The other wonderful thing about just using a 1/4 teaspoon of yeast is that you have a lot of time leeway as to when you need to bake your bread. So if you say to yourself, I don't think I can bake this until maybe 18 hours from now, a 1/4 teaspoon of yeast is going to serve you perfectly. Now, what we've talked about so far is just focusing on leaving our dough, as you see I've got some over there, leaving our dough on our counter to basically rise and, in essence, ferment. What if you would just like to have some dough in your fridge and you're really not going to be ready to bake it for maybe 24 hours or even 48 hours? What should you do? If you want to bake your dough 24 hours after making it, use a 1/2 teaspoon of yeast and then cover your bowl and stick it into your refrigerator. This will create a nice slow rise and you'll be ready to bake your bread after 24 hours. What if you want to stretch that time out even longer and bake your bread in 48 hours? You can do that too. All you're going to want to do is pull back the amount of yeast you use a 1/4 teaspoon of yeast, mix up your dough, and then put it in your refrigerator, and you can bake your bread 48 hours later. Now, I loosely use the word ferment when I'm talking about this. What we're talking about is letting the dough rise. But because we're using small amounts of yeast and we're letting the dough rise for a long period of time, I often think of this as a little bit of a mock sourdough or a little cheat, but I'm okay with that because if you have struggled with sourdough, getting your sourdough starter going, making sourdough bread, which I definitely can help you with that, but if you struggle with these things, and if sometimes you just want to use packaged yeast from the grocery store, then this is a good option for you, because this is going to create a bread very similar to those sourdough boules, as they are called, those rounds that you see at the bakeries. We're going to create a beautiful artisan loaf of bread by extending the rise time and using a little bit of yeast. Now, is it sourdough, official sourdough? No, it's more like a mock sourdough. But you know what? It's going to be delicious. Alrighty, well, we've talked a lot about yeast. What are the other 2 ingredients? Very easy, and I'm confident you've got these in your kitchen. One is salt, and you can use any kind of salt you have. And this is just a fine ground sea salt. Use whatever type of salt you have, but just use a fine ground option. Now, what if you say, oh, Mary, I'm on a low salt diet. I really don't want to put salt in the bread. Can I leave the salt out? Good news. Yes. You can be like a Tuscan in Italy. In Tuscany, they leave the salt out of their bread, so you can too. Now, there's a historical reason regarding a tax on salt as to why they left salt out of their bread, but you can leave salt out of your bread. It will have a slightly different, almost a little more blander flavor, because salt always improves flavor for most of us in our palates. But if you want to leave it out, the good news is you can. So since you can leave salt out, you can also manage how much salt you want to add to this bread. You can use a half a teaspoon, you can use a teaspoon, you can use a teaspoon and a half, you can even use up to 2 teaspoons. I have found, just my personal preference, is that about a teaspoon and a half of fine ground salt, specifically a fine ground sea salt, works very well. Our final ingredient is just some water. Now, how much water are you going to need? A lot is going to depend on the conditions in your kitchen as well as the conditions of the weather where you live. Most of the time you're going to want to start with about 1.5 cups of water and then work up from there. I live in a hot, dry climate and I usually need 2 cups of water. So that'll give you a good gauge as to how much water you may need. But we're going to start with 1.5 cups so I can show you what the texture looks like, and then I'm going to probably have to go up to 2 cups, and then you will see exactly how you want your dough to look, either using that 1.5 cups, using 1 3/4 cups, or even going up to 2 cups. It's all about the consistency of your dough and not the exact amount of water. Now I'm going to use bread flour, and the reason is bread flour, as the name implies, works very well for making bread. And the reason is it has a little more protein than all-purpose flour, and protein helps give a nice structure to your bread. But if you've got all-purpose flour, it's going to work, so don't worry about it. Now the good news is you don't have to weigh anything. Just take your basic dry measuring cup and scoop some flour out of your bag, and then just level it off with your knife, just like that. I'm going to do it right into this bag. I normally have this flour just in here, but I had the package so you could exactly see what type of flour I was using. And yes, I live in Texas, I shop at H-E-B. Then you're going to need a bowl. Any bowl. I'm using a glass bowl so you can see what I'm doing, but if you have a ceramic bowl, if you have a stainless steel bowl, whatever you have is fine. This recipe is very forgiving, so it's really not a big deal when you're measuring this flour. Don't feel that you have to get very exact. It's going to be fine because everything's dependent on the water and finding the right texture, which I'm going to show you. And you never have to worry. Another thing that's wonderful about this recipe is, say you add a little too much water and then you have a little bit of a gloopy mess, you just add more flour. So it's great. It's just so easy to work with. That's why I say anyone can make this. You can't go wrong. So I've got my 2nd cup of flour in my bowl. Now I'm going to go ahead and put in my 3rd cup. Now there is one thing I want to mention because I do get a lot of questions about this. I'm showing you here that I'm using organic flour. And for those of you who are familiar with H-E-B, you know that they're on a mission to provide a lot of organic products at a reasonable price for their consumers, for their shoppers. And this is not sponsored by H-E-B. I just shop at this grocery store and I really like it. But that is kind of their mission. So they make these things affordable and organic. But if you don't have the availability of an organic flour, don't worry. As I said, very forgiving recipe. It really doesn't matter. Use whatever bread flour or whatever all-purpose flour you have. Now, that kind of begs the question, can you use an all-purpose spelt flour or an all-purpose einkorn flour? And those are your ancient grains, and when I use the term all-purpose, it means they're not the whole grain version of those flours. They've had the bran and the germ sifted out of them. I've made videos where I've showed you how to grind einkorn, sift out the bran and the germ, and then have an all-purpose einkorn flour. And yes, you can make this bread with all-purpose einkorn flour, or you can make this with all-purpose spelt flour. Now, I've showed you how to make these things in a homemade way. If you buy them in an all-purpose form, you can certainly use those too. And what is so great about this particular recipe and using those ancient grain flours in their all-purpose form is that they absorb water differently than modern wheats. These flours have had the bran and the germ sifted out of them, but they were ground originally from modern day whole wheat flours. But einkorn flour and spelt flour and emmer, if that's sort of the one that's right in the middle, some people know it as farro. If you're using any of those ancient grain flours, they absorb water differently. But that's the beauty of this recipe, because you're going to be adding water little by little until you get the desired texture. And if you are using one of those ancient grain flours, you're going to wind up using less water. Now I'm just going to use a 1/4 teaspoon of yeast, and I'm just going to go ahead and sprinkle that right on top of my flour. And now I'm going to go ahead and add my 1.5 teaspoons of salt. Now, let's dispel this, what should I say, rumor? I don't know what the right word is, about salt and yeast. You do not have to just put the yeast in with the flour and the water and then later at some point massage in the salt. That is not necessary at all, and it seems awfully cumbersome to me. In order to kill your yeast, you would need a lot of salt. This little bit of salt that's mixed in with the flour won't kill your yeast, but you don't have to take my word for it. All the big baking sites like King Arthur Flour and Breadtopia, they'll all tell you the same thing. So if you wanted to go look over, say for example, kingarthurflour.com and just search, does salt kill yeast? And they will explain to you how a little bit of salt mixed in with your flour is not going to kill your yeast. But the good news is that this little bit of salt with our yeast in our flour does slightly slow down the fermentation process or the rise process. And that's a good thing. It's not going to completely stop it and kill your yeast. No, not at all. It might slow it down a little bit, and that's a good thing when you're making these artisan breads that you're allowing to give a good rise time to. Anywhere from 8 hours to 12 hours to 18 hours to 24 hours to 48 hours, as we discussed earlier. And what you will find with the rises that you do on your counter as opposed to in your refrigerator is that a lot will depend. I use the time frames relatively loosely because is your kitchen 65 degrees Fahrenheit or is it 80 degrees Fahrenheit? So if you're rising the dough on your counter and you make it in the morning and it's really hot in your kitchen and then you're going to be heating it up even more when you preheat the oven, which we'll talk about in a minute, then you want to figure on no more than 8 hours. If your kitchen is really, really cold, it may take a little longer with even a 1/2 teaspoon of yeast in your flour. So it's really, but you know what the bottom line is? It's not going to be significant. So if you make your dough at 7 or 8 o'clock in the morning and you want to bake it sometime in the afternoon, even if your kitchen is cool, you're going to find that it has had a nice rise with a 1/2 teaspoon of yeast. I just want you to keep in mind, it's not an exact science. There's a lot of wiggle room with these slow risen breads. So even if you say, oh no, I'm in a rush, I didn't allow enough time, it's only been 5 hours, chances are it's going to come out okay. Will it be maybe will it have risen as high as maybe one that's been allowed to go 8 hours or one with a 1/4 teaspoon that maybe has gone 16 hours? Maybe not, but the bottom line is no one's going to really notice. All they're going to know is you baked them bread and your house is going to smell amazing. Alrighty, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a whisk and I'm just going to incorporate the yeast and the salt into the flour. Couldn't be easier. Just as a side note, in case you're interested in the type of yeast that I like to use, it's simply the SAF Instant Premium Yeast. You can probably find this at your grocery store. If not, I'll be sure to put a link in the description below. But again, as I said earlier, pretty much any yeast can do. Well, we'll start with about 1.5 cups of water. I've just made a little well in the flour, no big deal. And then I'm just going to go ahead and start pouring my water in. Well, I've poured in 1.5 cups of water into my dough or into my flour. And now I'm just going to take a little spatula. They call this like a spoonless spatula, but a wooden spoon will work just fine too. And I'm just going to start mixing the water into the flour. And the point of this, in terms of getting the right consistency, is we want to make sure that all of the flour is completely moistened with the water, and that we have what's often referred to as like a shaggy consistency, even almost a little past a shaggy consistency. We want a relatively well hydrated, malleable looking dough. Now you'll see with 1.5 cups, in the climate I'm in and in my kitchen, this is quite dry. This is not what you're looking for. So you're going to want to continue. If yours now has mixed up and looks like what my final product will look like, which I'll show you in a minute, you're all set. But if yours is looking dry like mine, we're going to go ahead and add in more water. Now, you could go 1/4 cup at a time and keep mixing. But I know, just kind of based on my kitchen and experience, I'm going to need the final 1/2 cup, because I generally need, at this time of year, I'm making this really when it's very hot here. I'm filming this in August, and August, September, even pretty much to October. It's pretty warm here, so I generally need the full 2 cups. So I'm going to go ahead and just add in my remaining 1/2 cup of water, and I'm just going to start mixing this until I get all of that water incorporated and all of my dough nicely saturated, and then I'll show you what you're going to be looking for in terms of consistency. So just a few spins around with your spatula or your wooden spoon will incorporate the water, and then the texture that you're looking for is this very, very shaggy, very well hydrated dough. It's like almost like gloopy, but that is exactly what you're looking for, because all of this hydration is what is really going to help this dough do a nice job and turn into a beautiful artisan bread. So that's what you're looking for. So just add enough water until you get to this consistency. Now, as I said earlier, if you find that you've gone past this type of consistency, just sprinkle in some flour. You'll be fine. Now all you have to do is cover your bowl. You can use plastic wrap, a dish towel, whatever you have. I'm lucky that this particular bowl comes with a lid. And that's it. And now I'm going to put this on my counter. I'm just going to leave it there. And this can sit there for, since we used 1/4 teaspoon of yeast, this can sit on my counter for 16 hours. Or if I want to tuck this into the fridge and bake this 48 hours later, I might do that also, especially since I've got 2 over there on my back counter. That might actually work well. But again, depending on the temperature in your kitchen, just eyeball it. You know, everybody says, you know, when it looks about double in bulk, that's fine. That's, just eyeball it. Don't worry that, oh, is it double? Is it not double? If it's bubbly on top and there are some little lumps and bumps and little holes that have been caused by bubbles, it's ready to bake. And I'm going to show you that in the ones that I have over on my back counter. Now this bowl was made with 1/4 teaspoon of yeast, and I made this one before I made this one, which I made with 1/2 teaspoon of yeast. This has probably gone a good 15 to 16 hours, and this has probably gone somewhere in the 12-hour mark. And so I want to show you this one and see how it's looking so that you will know what you're looking for as well. Now, when I checked this at 8 hours, it looked pretty good back then too, but with the magic of television, so to speak, and having to wait until I could actually film this and show it to you, I did need to go a little longer, but that's okay, because again, this is all very forgiving. So if you make this in the morning and you want to bake it for dinner, great. If you bake this at night and you want to bake it at breakfast time, and there has been a 12-hour span and you've used a half a teaspoon of yeast, you're going to be fine. Now here is what the dough looks like after about 12 or so hours. Somewhere between 8 and 12 hours, it's going to look like this. And you're going to see it looks kind of bubbly, kind of lumpy, and I don't know exactly how this will appear in pictures or on video, but it may almost look to you like there are a lot of little black dots. That's what my husband was thinking. And I can see how if you're a new home baker, it might look like that to you as well. But all that is just bubbles. It's just air trapped in the dough. And what you're going to want to look for is a lot of lumps and bumps like this, a lot of little bubbles. And when you shake it, like this, it's going to kind of shake like Jell-O. That's perfect. Now this is the one that has the 1/4 teaspoon of yeast, and you'll see they basically look identical. A lot of little bubbles, a lot of little lumps and bumps. When you shake it, it looks just like Jell-O. And this is exactly what you're going to be looking for, and it's what you're going to see. And again, it's very forgiving. On your counter with the half a teaspoon of yeast, 8 to 12 hours, somewhere in there, with the 1/4 teaspoon of yeast, somewhere in the 16-hour range. You even have a little wiggle room there. If you go past 16 hours, I don't want you to worry. And both of these, this one can do very well in the fridge for 24 hours, and this one can do very well in the fridge for 48 hours. And you have to forgive me if I repeat a lot. It's just I know sometimes some folks will hop around a lot in a video, so I do like to repeat so that maybe you fall on a part that is answering a question that you might have. Now, I think a lot of folks will be making this dough in the morning and baking it for dinner. And you're probably going to be using that half a teaspoon of yeast. So I'll go ahead and bake up this one, and I can show you how that comes. It's going to have a crisp crust, beautiful crumb, and it's going to be very tasty. Now, this isn't required, but if you have one of these little plastic, very inexpensive bench scrapes, this works great for getting your dough out of the bowl and then also just using it to help you get it into a round ball. But if you don't have this, don't worry, you can also do it with your hands. All we're going to do at this point is just sprinkle some flour onto our cutting board, or onto our baking board in essence. This is actually an Italian pasta board for making pasta. But whatever you have, if you've got I've got tiles, so it doesn't work as well, but if you've got a smooth countertop, you can do it right on your countertop. Now I'm just going to angle this. In essence, it's going to start spilling out, but I want you to see as the bubbles become elongated, you can actually see and look at all this wonderful gluten formation up here. How beautiful this dough has achieved a wonderful consistency. So now we'll just empty this out of our bowl onto our floured board. I sprinkled some flour and then I rubbed it around with my hand, and now I'm just going to dump the dough right onto this floured board. Now I've just got my hands floured. I'm just sprinkling from the board a little bit of flour. We don't want to add too much more flour. That's the whole kind of point of this, is that it should be very shaggy and moist. And that's where these bench scrapes come in really handy. We're just going to pull that over, pull this over, pull the other side over, and pull that over, and we're just gonna kind of work it to where we get it into a ball. So once you've just kind of folded all 4 sides on top of each other, then you're just gonna flip it over, and then all we're gonna do is just kind of circle it around a little, make a little tension on top, and form it into a ball best we can. So you're just going to move this around in a circle. just best you can. And don't worry if it sticks a little, you can sprinkle it with a little flour. Another trick you can also do is to just wet your hands. A lot of folks like to do that, and I don't blame them. I like that method too when you're making these breads that don't involve any kneading. At this point, all we're going to do is take this bowl or a dish towel, whatever you want to use. I like to just use the bowl that I took the batter out of or the dough out of and cover it like this. We're going to leave it for 30 minutes. Now, while this is resting for 30 minutes, we're going to go ahead and we're going to preheat our oven. Now, if you're using a Dutch oven, you can go ahead and put that into the cold oven so it will preheat as well with the oven. Generally, what you want to use is somewhere between a 4-quart to a 6-quart Dutch oven. And what I have here is a 5.5-quart. If you're just using a baking sheet, you don't have to do anything. All you need to do is just get your baking sheet available, put a piece of parchment paper on it if you've got it, and set it aside and be ready to put your dough on that to bake it. Now I'll teach you a little trick if you're not using a Dutch oven and you are using a baking sheet and you still want to create the steam that is naturally created by having the bread in a Dutch oven with the lid on it. You can do a couple of different things. If you want, you can put your dough on your baking sheet into the oven, give it a little squirt of water, and then quickly close your oven door. But a better thing to do is on the very lowest rack of your oven, put some sort of heat-proof container. It could be a heat-proof frying pan, it could be a heat-proof pie pan, anything like that that you would use to bake something or cook something in your oven. Put some ice in there and then go ahead and put that into the oven along with your dough that's on the baking sheet. But you're just going to put the vessel holding the ice, the oven-proof vessel holding the ice, on the lowest rack of your oven. And that's going to create a lot of steam in your oven. It's not exactly like professional bakers, we're just home bakers, but it will create steam as the ice melts and help create a lovely bread. Now, to start this process, I like to preheat my oven to 500 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, we're not going to bake the bread at 500 degrees Fahrenheit, but I like to preheat the oven that hot. That way, when we open the door, get the dough into the Dutch oven, open the door again, get the Dutch oven back into the oven, we're lowering the temperature. So I at least like to give it a good starting point, so to speak. Now, what temperature to bake your bread at? I have a very small oven. I have the smallest wall oven that's made. And so I bake my bread on the middle rack, and I recommend that no matter what size oven you have, you bake your bread on the middle rack. And I generally bake my bread somewhere between 425 degrees Fahrenheit and 450 degrees Fahrenheit. If you have a very large wall oven, or you have the type of oven that's underneath your cooktop, an actual stove that's generally very large, you may need to heat your oven or bake your bread at 475 degrees Fahrenheit. There are some variations, and you will get to know your oven the best after you bake this one time. If you bake your bread at 425 degrees Fahrenheit and you find that the bottom just didn't brown up as you had hoped after 30 minutes, next time bake it at 450 degrees Fahrenheit. But don't worry, I'm going to tell you how to fix it if it's not the exact color that you were hoping for. If you find you bake it at 450 and the bottom gets too dark, then next time around, just lower it to 425 degrees. And so it's just a learning process. The same thing with 475. If you find that that was a little too hot for your oven, pull it back to 450. There's just a little bit of experimentation the first time around. But if for any reason it's underbaked a bit, don't worry, because After 30 minutes, we're going to remove the lid and allow the bread to bake for a little bit uncovered. And at that point, you can check your bread. And if the bottom looks as though it's very light, you can just pop the temperature up to from 425, for example, to 450, or from 450 to 475, and allow it to bake for those last few minutes at the higher temperature, and everything will come out perfect. What if at 30 minutes you check it and it's a little too brown on the bottom? Well, what I generally recommend is don't worry about it. Chances are it's not overbaked. Chances are it's not that brown, and chances are it's not burnt. If it is, you can always let it cool, and then you can take a butter knife and just scrape off some of the brown on the bottom, which will just flake right off into your garbage can. But chances are the bottom is going to look okay, regardless of the temperature you bake it at, if you've got it on the middle rack. But if you're exceptionally concerned about it, you can always do little cheats in the beginning when you're first making bread and learning how to make bread. Check it at 20 minutes. Check it at 25 minutes. Just be careful, use your pot holders and all of that. And if it looks like the bottom is browning too much, just lower the temperature of your oven and you'll be fine. There is a little bit of a learning curve. Now, since I have a very small oven, I'm going to bake this particular bread at 425 degrees Fahrenheit for 30 minutes. And I'll have all of these details in a blog post that'll correspond with this video. That'll be over on my website, marysnest.com, and I'll be sure to put a link to that recipe in the description below. The most important thing that I want to reassure you about is that bread baking is just a learning process, and this is a very easy recipe. It's very forgiving, and you're going to find after you make this a few times, you're going to get a good feel as to exactly how much water you need, and you're also going to get a good feel as to what temperature works best in your oven. For those new to home baking and specifically making these artisan-style breads, I wanted to share a little history with you about these type of breads. They're very easy to make, as we've seen, because you mix the flour and the water, the salt and the yeast, and then you just let it sit for a while, depending on how much yeast you use and how long you want it to sit. And then you basically dump it out onto a floured surface, and 1, 2, 3, just kind of fold it over itself to make it easy to flip it, and then just use your hands to cup it into a bowl and then cover it, and that's it. There's no kneading, no nothing. This is basically one of the easiest artisan breads you'll ever make, and it's pretty foolproof. So how did this technique come about? It was popularized about 20 years ago, maybe a little less than 20 years ago. However, it's been around a lot longer than that. I want to read something to you that I wrote in my cookbook, the Modern Pioneer Cookbook, and if you've got the cookbook, what I'm going to read is on page 113. And this is just a little side note, but I wanted to let you know, give you a little preview, I'm working on my second cookbook, and I'm just about to finish it. And in October, my editor will be here along with the photographer and the food stylist right here in my kitchen. And they'll be here for about 2 weeks taking pictures for the second cookbook. And I'll be sure to take you along with some pictures from behind the scenes. So stay tuned for that. And my cookbook will be out next year, 2025. So on page 113 of my cookbook, I write, "No knead bread through the centuries." You may recall that back in 2006, no knead bread made a splash on the baking scene thanks to a newspaper article highlighting an easy technique for making artisan quality bread. Although not a true sourdough, that's what I love about it. It makes it nice and easy for folks who may have struggled with sourdough. Although not a true sourdough, this modern no-knead bread used only a 1/4 teaspoon of packaged yeast and a long, slow rise. All of a sudden, this bread was heralded as and forgive the pun, and I actually write in here, all of a sudden this bread was heralded as, and forgive the pun, the best thing since sliced bread. And you may recall it was Jim Leahy from the Sullivan Street Bakery, and he even wrote a cookbook all about this technique called My Bread. Very cute, My Bread. But did you know that no-knead bread is actually nothing new? Even in the 1940s, Pillsbury Mills was touting a 25-cent pamphlet titled Bake the No-Knead Way, Ann Pillsbury's Amazing Discovery. Now keep in mind, Ann Pillsbury was a fictional character, just like Betty Crocker, but both were beloved by home cooks who were ready to embrace what Ann was teaching. So how did Ann make this amazing discovery? I'm not exactly sure, but I will share that back in the 1700s, 1739 to be exact, when Eliza Smith was sharing her recipe in a cookbook titled The Complete Housewife. And complete is C-O-M-P-L-E-A-T, The Complete Housewife. It's the old-fashioned spelling, in case you're looking to find a vintage copy of this online. In her recipe for what she called French bread, when describing how to handle the dough, Eliza tells us a peck of fine flour, a little salt, a pint of ale yeast, which I'll explain in a minute, a pint of ale yeast, stir it about with your hand, but be sure you don't knead them. Apparently, Eliza had made her own amazing discovery. But Eliza didn't have modern-day commercially packaged yeast, like Jim Leahy did and like Ann Pillsbury did, or at least the Pillsbury Company did. So what did she do? Well, maybe her recipe discovery went back to the Middle Ages, and possibly well before, when French bakers were making sourdough bread. And in parentheses, I write, Eliza's quote-unquote French bread recipe, her French bread perhaps, that was perhaps her French bread that she was referring, maybe not the French bread necessarily that we think of when we think of maybe a baguette, but she was calling something French bread because maybe she had gotten the recipe from these earlier French bakers who were making sourdough and making a loose dough and letting it work its magic over time and not kneading it. So I go back, sorry, I got a little distracted there. Well, maybe her recipe discovery went back to the Middle Ages and possibly well before, when French bakers were making sourdough bread. Eliza's French bread, perhaps, that most likely was never kneaded, because they were just letting the sourdough, the yeast, the wild yeast from the sourdough do the work. They had to make a lot of bread. They didn't have time all day long to be kneading away. So instead of kneading the dough, the sourdough starter did all the work during a slow rise, in the same way Eliza's pint of ale yeast, you might remember that I mentioned from her earlier recipe, and this is otherwise known as the wild yeast barm. It's sort of the foam that would occur on top of the beer making process. And so Eliza's pint of ale yeast, otherwise known as the wild yeast barm, rose her bread with a slow rise and no kneading. So like Eliza and the French bakers before her, we too are going to be traditional bakers. You know, I always talk about having a traditional foods kitchen. We are going to be traditional bakers by embracing, in this case, I'm specifically talking about a sourdough starter, and the no-knead way of baking. But what's so beautiful about all of this is whether you have a sourdough starter, whether you have a little commercial yeast, whether you've got some barm, maybe you're making homemade beer and you've got some of that ale, the yeast from the ale, and you're using that. There's all different types of things that you can use to rise your bread without kneading it. You just need a little bit of whatever you're using, whether it's packaged yeast, sourdough starter, or barm, and you let that do the work. And that's what makes these breads so easy and basically foolproof. Now it's been about 30 minutes and my oven has come up to 500 degrees Fahrenheit. Now all I'm going to do is take some flour and just sprinkle it on top of this mound of dough. And I'm just going to score it once. If you want, you can just dump it into your Dutch oven or put it onto your baking sheet as is and let it crack wherever it would like. But I'm going to score it just so I can show you what to do if you're completely new to this. Now, if you're an experienced baker, you might have something known as a lame. If you're new to home baking, a lame is, or known as a French lame, is a tool that has a very sharp razor blade on a handle. And you use the razor blade to make different scoring patterns on your dough before baking it. And you might see some people are very good at it and they make beautiful decorations. But don't worry, you don't need a lame. As I said, you can just put this in as is, or if you do want to score it, you can just take a little paring knife and with the tip, just make any type of score you want. You can do 3 straight lines across. You can do a little bit of a curved line, so to speak. That's the type that when you make a little curve like that, sometimes it'll split in a way that'll create what people will call a little ear that's nice and crusty on top. Hopefully that works. I've baked these for many years now, and sometimes my scoring comes great. Sometimes it just looks like it naturally split, even though I had scored it. So whatever you want to do, again, this is all very forgiving. Decide whatever way you want to do it, and it's going to be great. Now, if you're doing this on a baking sheet, all you're going to want to do is use your bench scrape, or if you have a spatula, those pancake spatulas that are kind of round work really well, you're just going to put this right onto your baking sheet. I like to put a piece of parchment paper down, but it's definitely not required. And speaking of parchment paper, if you're a little nervous, if you're new to this and you're a little nervous about transferring this and plopping it down into a really hot Dutch oven, you can again use your bench scrape or a spatula to pick this up, put it onto your parchment paper, and then lower your parchment paper down into your Dutch oven. If you do use parchment paper, just make sure it's completely tucked into your Dutch oven before you put the lid on. Now I took my Dutch oven out of my oven, I lowered the temperature to 425, and now I'm going to take this lid off. There may be a little steam, so I'm going to open it away from me. Alrighty, now what I'm going to do is just put this lid on a pot holder over there, and this is piping hot. You can really feel it. So I picked up the dough. I actually used my pancake spatula. These work great for that process. And I dumped it down into my Dutch oven. Now we're all ready to put the lid back on. And once we put that lid back on, we're going to go ahead and pop that into the oven. Well, my timer just went off at 30 minutes, so I took this out of my oven, and now we'll have the reveal for how it looks after 30 minutes. And again, if you're doing this with a Dutch oven, always open away from you because there's always the possibility that steam will come out. Ooh, and it did. Oh, that looks fantastic. Now what we're going to do is put it back into the oven and let it brown up without the lid on, and we're going to let it brown up a little more on top. Still at 425 Fahrenheit, and I'm going to keep an eye on it. Again, you know, it's not an exact science. You just kind of got to watch it. Sometimes it reaches the color I like within 5 minutes, sometimes 10 minutes, sometimes 15 minutes. So I'm just going to keep an eye on it, and then I'll show you how it looks once it browns up on the top. There's just one other thing I wanted to mention to you that you might have a question about when you're baking in a Dutch oven or on a baking sheet. that when you put it down onto the baking sheet that has not been lined with a piece of parchment paper, you can sprinkle a bit of flour. The same is true in a Dutch oven. If you're not using parchment paper, you can sprinkle a little flour, sometimes cornmeal, sometimes people will use wheat bran, different things to give the bread a little cushion, in essence, on the bottom. I had a lot of flour on my board when I was shaping the boule, so I had a lot of flour already on the bottom, so I didn't feel it was necessary to add more. But you can really just sort of experiment with that. It helps with preventing it from scorching and sticking. So you always want to make sure that if you're not using parchment paper, you've got some flour underneath your boule, or you throw in a little cornmeal or a little wheat bran. Look at this glorious bread. Now, in my oven, this was in there for about 15 minutes at 425 degrees Fahrenheit to brown up like this on top, and I think it's perfect. Now, I want to mention one thing. If you used parchment paper to drop your bread originally into a Dutch oven, when you remove the lid and get ready to put it back into your oven to brown on top, you want to shimmy out, so to speak, the parchment paper, and just use, a pot holder. Be very careful. Everything's hot, including the parchment paper. And shimmy that parchment paper out and just put that aside. The reason is, if you leave the parchment paper in the Dutch oven, when you go to put it back into the oven to brown up the top, it tends to keep the sides from browning. So you just want to make sure that you shimmy that out. Now, if you're doing this on a baking sheet, you don't have to worry about these steps. You're going to be baking your bread on your baking sheet in your oven, and at 30 minutes it's probably going to look really good, and you don't need to bake it that little bit of extra time to brown on top, because it's been exposed to the heat for the total time, the total baking time. And if at 30 minutes it doesn't look where you want it to be, let it go another 5 or 10 minutes, whatever the case may be, until it does have that wonderful golden brown color. Now, this should move around very easily, so you can see, if you can hear that. This should move around very easily in your Dutch oven, and it's just a matter of using a spatula or something to kind of wedge it out, and then we're going to go ahead and put it on its cooling rack. Now, all I've done is taken my spatula and wedged it underneath, and now I'm going to transfer it right over to the cooling rack. Now that I've lifted it out of the Dutch oven, you can see the flour that remained behind in the Dutch oven. And so that was basically my base that was underneath my dough when I put it in. So if you feel that you don't have enough flour maybe under your dough, maybe it's sticking a little when you go to pick it up and drop it in, you can always make sure that you put a little flour, as I said, cornmeal or wheat bran. Those are kind of the common things that people will put down at the bottom of a Dutch oven, or for that matter, on the baking sheet when they're baking bread. You may have even noticed that when you've purchased bread, either from the bakery section at your grocery store or a regular bakery, sometimes it looks like there's a little cornmeal on the bottom. Now, I just want to tap this so you can hear how wonderful this crust is. Can you hear that? I'm leaning in with the mic. It's beautiful. Now this, as you can see, some people call this the ear. This is where I had scored it. But as I mentioned, sometimes these breads have a mind of their own, and it might split in other places, but that doesn't affect the taste. Nothing to worry about. And if you didn't want to make a mark on top of your boule, you can go ahead and just dump it right in, and it'll crack wherever it feels like cracking. Now, this is warm. It's very difficult to resist warm bread, but I'm just going to give this a little more time to cool. What happens if you cut into bread when it's really hot, it can get a little appearance of being somewhat gummy. in its, as they call the crumb, the interior texture. So it's best to let it cool a little. If you can let it cool completely and you have wonderful willpower, that's great. But if not, at least let it cool to where you can comfortably hold it. And something I want to mention to you, especially if you're new to baking, experienced bakers will know this, but you can tap the bottom. I don't know if you can hear that on the mic. And it sounds kind of hollow. That tells you your bread is done. Well, this has cooled, so we'll start to slice this and we'll put some butter on it and do a taste test. Gee, where should we cut into this? Everything looks so good. How about right here? I always love the end. That's my favorite piece. Listen to that. A serrated knife is great for this, by the way. Oh, it looks wonderful. I'll take a close-up picture so that you can see, and we'll definitely make a few more slices. Look at these glorious slices. Oh, and the aroma, it's so wonderful. Look at this beautiful bread. You're gonna love this because it's nice and crusty on the outside, yet it's definitely tender inside. You could make some wonderful sandwiches with this toasted. Anyway, I mean, it's just a magnificent bread and so easy to make. And I want to mention, we already talked about making this with different types of ancient grains in their all-purpose form. You can also use this recipe. It's very versatile. You can do half all-purpose flour, half all-grain flour. You can throw in nuts. You can throw in dried fruits. You can use different sweeteners if you want to add a bit of sweetness to the bread. There's just so much versatility in this recipe, and I will definitely share more. If you like this, look at this butter. It's so yellow. Got to put a little butter on it. If you like this video, let me know in the comments below, and I'll definitely make more breads using this same technique, but maybe some that are sweeter, maybe like a cranberry walnut bread as we go into the holidays. Alrighty, now the taste test. This is so good. You are going to really enjoy this bread. Well, you've learned how to make no-knead sandwich bread, no-knead batter bread. You've also learned how to make bread the old-fashioned way, and you've learned how to master making a beautiful artisan boule. And really, that artisan boule is so easy, anybody can make it, right? And I know you can. Now that you've mastered those types of breads, are you ready to graduate up to sourdough? If so, I have the complete sourdough starter guide for you. So let's get started and make our starter. Well, I've received many questions about sourdough starter and baking sourdough bread. And today I want to share with you a very easy way to make a sourdough starter. And all you need is some all-purpose flour and some water. Nothing fancy. People have been making sourdough starter for thousands of years, so I'm confident that pretty much anybody can do this. And what I'm recommending today is just to use all-purpose flour and water. Now, in a previous video, I shared with you how I make my foolproof sourdough starter using rye flour. And the reason I use rye flour is it's much easier to get a sourdough starter going when you use rye flour. But many of you have shared with me you can't find rye flour, or you don't like rye flour, and you don't want to make rye bread, or whatever the case may be, and have asked me to show you how to do this just using all-purpose flour. Now, one thing I want to say, and this is my starter here that is made with rye flour, that even if you decide you want to start your sourdough starter using rye flour, because maybe you find that it is easier to do, you can transition it to any type of starter you want. When you make the transition, and I have a video on that which I'll link to, you just start feeding it the flour that you want to. So I could transition this if I wanted by starting to feed it with all-purpose flour. But if you just want to start right from the beginning using all-purpose flour, that's what we're going to do today. Now don't worry, you don't need a scale. You don't need to weigh the flour and the water to make sure that you have exactly the proper hydration and so on and so forth. And I'll explain hydration in a minute. What you can do is to scoop your flour into a cup. And today I'm just using a half measure cup. You can start your starter just using tablespoons of flour. You can start it using a half a cup of flour. You can even start using a whole cup of flour. It really doesn't matter. It's whatever amount that you want to start your starter with and how much flour you then want to be feeding it with. I often have a lot of sourdough starter because I enjoy actually baking with just sourdough starter. So when I go to quote-unquote discard my sourdough starter when I feed it, I don't actually discard what I'm removing. I usually bake with it. And I'll make flatbread or pancakes or different things like that. I have a number of videos on what to do with discarded sourdough starter, and I'll link to those in case that's something that you're interested in. But in any event, you just want to scoop it in like this, rather than just scooping out a whole bunch with the half cup measure. If you take a teaspoon and just put it into the cup, you'll get closer to the amount of water that you're also going to put in the half cup measure. So then we're just going to level that off, nothing fancy, and we're going to put that into this vessel. I like using a little flat bottom bowl like this. You can use a round bottom bowl, or you can even use a canning jar if you want, any type of canning jar. But I like to use some type of bowl because I find that it aerates nicely. And I believe, in my humble opinion, that you'll have a greater level of success if you can have it nicely aerated, especially if you're new to making sourdough starter. But certainly, if you want to use a jar, you can. Using a jar like this does make it very easy to see exactly how much of a rise that you've gotten from your starter. But today, I'm going to do it in this bowl, and I'm just going to go ahead and dump my all-purpose flour into the bowl. And the next thing I'm going to do is now measure out a half a cup of water. Now, this is what is known as 100% hydration, that we're using the same amount of flour as we are using the same amount of water, a half a cup. Now, if you did have a scale, you could weigh it and make sure that it was 100% exact. However, don't worry about it if you don't have a scale. I never weigh my flour and water, and I always have success with my starters. So, because what I find is if you just scoop the flour, as I showed you, into the half cup measure or a whole cup measure, whatever device you're using to measure, it's close enough. And if we weighed the flour and the water, they'd probably be pretty close. So this is what I'm calling a 100% hydration, or pretty close to 100% hydration. Then at this point, all we want to do is take I've got a little whisk here, and mix the flour and the water together to make sure that the flour is fully incorporated with the water. So all you're looking for is to just make like a slurry, just a nice flour and water mixture like that. And I'll take a up-close picture and overlay it so that you can see it up close. And also I want to mention, I'll have all the written directions for making this and all the details of what we're going to talk about in terms of diagnosing problems with sourdough starter and whatnot in this video today. I'll have all of that over on my website, marysnest.com, and I'll also put a link in the description below to the exact post that'll have all of this that you can print out and keep for your records. Now, the next thing that we're going to do is just take this lid, put it on loosely, you don't have to press it down or anything, and set this aside in a warm place in your kitchen, somewhere between 70 and 80 degrees Fahrenheit. Just put it in a warm place like that, leave it undisturbed, out of direct sunlight, and just let it sit for 2 days. Now, after letting your starter sit for 2 days, you're going to remove the lid that you've just had on loosely, and you're going to remove a half worth, or half of this, and that's going to be your quote-unquote discarded sourdough starter. Now, you will not have seen much activity at this point, and that's fine. You're on the right path. Now you're going to repeat the same step from the very beginning. You're going to take your half cup of flour that you've spooned into your measuring cup, and you're going to add a half a cup of water. And then we're going to take our whisk once again and give this a good mix. And once you get that nicely incorporated with another nice slurry mixture, all you're going to do is cover this loosely, again with a lid. You don't have to press it down, just loosely. And if you're using a bowl, you can just use a little tea towel or plastic wrap, whatever you have, but just loose. You want to let some air be able to circulate in there. So now that's the third day, and we're going to start from here feeding this starter every 12 hours. So if by the second day, say for example it's 9 a.m. and we've taken out half and fed this with the half cup of flour and half cup of water, we're going to want to feed this again at 9 o'clock tonight. Now for this starter, it's been 12 hours, so now this needs to be fed. So we're just going to want to remove about half of this, and then we're going to repeat the same steps where we feed it again with the flour and the water. And I just want to mention that down in the description below, I'll put timestamps for throughout this video where I do each of these feedings and then each of the problems that we diagnose. So we removed about half. Now we'll add in our half cup flour and our half cup of water. And we'll mix this up again until we get a nice slurry. Now, at this point, you may not have seen any activity yet, and that's completely normal, so it's nothing to worry about. Often with an all-purpose flour starter, it can take about 7 days to get it to where you need it to be. With a rye flour starter, maybe about 4 days, 4 to 5 days. With whole wheat starter, maybe 5 or 6 days. And with an all-purpose flour starter, it can take a good week or so. So you might, by this third day in the evening when you go to feed it, you might see a few bubbles, you might not, but it's no cause for concern. So again, you're just going to have your nice slurry mix, and then you're going to want to put a lid on loosely. Again, find a warm place in the kitchen, somewhere between 70 and 80, or anywhere in your house for that matter, between 70 and 80 degrees Fahrenheit. And you'll just want to set that aside, and then it will need to be fed again in 12 hours. Now 12 hours later, you may find you are starting to see some bubbles, and I'll take an up-close picture so that you can see that up close. And now you're ready to do the same thing. You're going to remove about half, you're going to add a half a cup of flour and a half a cup of water, and you're going to cover it loosely and let it sit for another 12 hours. And then at that point, you're going to come back, you're going to remove some, you're going to feed it, just as we've done so far, and you're just going to keep watching it until you get a really nice, frothy, bubbly sourdough starter. Now you've reached day 7, and you've been feeding your starter every 12 hours, discarding some, replenishing some, and you finally see some froth and some bubbles. Now I'm just going to move all of our various starters in various stages out of the way, and I want to show you what to expect from this day 7 starter. Now I'm going to overlay some pictures so you can see how by day 7 this is all frothy, and then I'll also put in a picture so that you can see from the side here the little bubbles that have started forming. Now, a brand new starter is not going to be as hearty as a seasoned starter, one that you've had going for a long time. Like this one, my older starter that I've had going a long time, definitely looks different. And I'll overlay a picture so you can also see this level of frothiness and the various bubbles on the side here. However, if you reach day 7 and it's frothy and it's got some nice bubbles, you can definitely bake with this. And I'll just scoop some so you can see the level of frothiness that this starter has. And that, as I said, is all ready to bake with. Now, what if by day 7 you're not seeing any bubbles, you're not seeing any froth, or maybe you're seeing just a few little bubbles, don't worry. If you're using all-purpose flour, it can even take a little more than 7 days. Up to 10 days is not uncommon. But what you'll want to do is maybe start feeding it every 8 hours instead of every 12 hours. And then hopefully by day 10, it should start to be frothy and have bubbles. Now, if by day 10 it's not as frothy and bubbly as you thought, don't worry. If you do see some bubbles and some activity, you can still try and go ahead and bake with it. Sometimes if your kitchen is exceptionally on the cool side, as I had said in the beginning, somewhere between 70 degrees Fahrenheit and 80 degrees Fahrenheit is kind of a nice range of temperatures for sourdough starter. However, if it's a little cooler, say 68 degrees Fahrenheit in your kitchen, your starter can still get going. It may just not look as active and as healthy, for lack of a better word, compared to a starter that might have been in a warmer temperature. But that doesn't mean that you can't bake with it. You can. And if you're going to err one way or the other, too cool or too warm, you're better off erring on the side of too cool. And the reason for that is even if your kitchen or the area where you have your sourdough starter resting is a little cooler, yeast does better than bad bacteria when things are a little cooler. Yes, yeast likes it warm and cozy and all of that, but under conditions where it is a little cooler, your yeast will be more likely to proliferate than your bad bacteria. And that's helpful if it's taking a little longer for your starter to get going. Because if it is taking a little longer for your sourdough starter to get going, there's more likelihood that you may develop mold. And mold would appear as something fuzzy, and it might have a pink or orange tint to it. And then unfortunately, you have to discard everything and start all over again. But the chances of that happening, if your sourdough starter is on the cooler side, is less likely. So it's not necessarily a bad thing if your starter does wind up taking more than 7 days, possibly because your environment is cooler. The yeast may be proliferating slower, but it's proliferating faster than the bad bacteria. Now let's talk about diagnosing some other problems as well. Say you're just not getting any activity out of your starter after 7, 8, 9, 10 days. Review what you did. Did you use a flour that was fresh and not expired? The fresher your flour, the better. Now certainly you can just buy a plain all-purpose flour from the grocery store that's not expired and use that. Now, if you have wheat berries and you grind them yourself, and then you sift out the bran and the germ to make your own fresh all-purpose flour at home, and you use that, all the better. And the same holds true for any grain. If you have whole wheat or wheat berries and you grind them and you make whole wheat flour and you don't sift out any of the bran and germ and you want to make your starter with that, that's great and it's very fresh and it should work very well. The same for rye or einkorn or emmer or spelt. Any form of wheat berry or other whole grain that you grind and then start using as your base for your sourdough starter is going to be very helpful. But if you're just using flour that you buy in the bag from the grocery store, that can work too. Just make sure that it's not expired. The next thing you want to think about is the water that you used. Did you use filtered water that did not have chlorine in it? And that can either be, bottled water that you purchased, or if you have a system in your home that filters out the chlorine, that's great. Or if you just use tap water, did you let it sit overnight and let some of the chlorine evaporate? That is what you want to do. You want to use water that's as low in chlorine as possible. And the reason is the chlorine can interfere with the ability of the yeast and the good bacteria to get this sourdough starter going. So think about those two things. Was your flour fresh? At least, if not freshly ground, was it fresh from the grocery store? And was your water as low in chlorine as possible? Now, one thing I want to mention about the vessel that you use to start your sourdough starter in, I'm using glass, but you don't need to. You can use metal. Metal, the stainless steel bowls, whatever you have on hand, won't kill your starter, and it won't impede its ability to get started. Now, once you have a successful sourdough starter going, let's talk about some of the things that can happen with it and diagnosing some of those problems. Now, say you bake every day or relatively close to every day, and you're going to keep your sourdough starter on the counter and you're going to feed it regularly. Don't worry if you get a little off in terms of your feeding. It does not need to be exactly every 12 hours. You're not going to kill it. Sourdough starters are actually amazingly hardy once they get going, and older starters, the longer you have it, become even more hardy. And something I'll tell you that I find rather amazing is that the gold miners up in Alaska would actually use their discarded sourdough starter to block the wind in their cabins. They would put it between the logs or wherever they had drafts coming in their cabins. And then when they needed sourdough starter, say the one they had died or they were out prospecting and weren't able to be feeding their starter or whatever the case may be, they would actually chip some out, rehydrate it, and get it going. So sourdough starters are very hardy. So don't worry, as I said, if you don't feed it exactly every 12 hours, even if you accidentally miss a feeding, you're not going to kill it. Now, not only is it okay to not be exact about the 12-hour feedings, what about the amounts of flour and water? Again, don't worry. If you feed it a little too much flour or a little too much water, it seems a little too soupy or a little too thick, you're not going to kill it. It's going to be fine. So don't panic. Even if you use the spoon scoop method and you put your flour in and you put your water in and it seems a little more watery than it was before, or this time maybe it seems a little thicker than it was before, it's going to be fine. So don't worry about that either. Really, there are only two enemies, so to speak, of a sourdough starter. One is heat and one is just severe neglect. You never want to keep your sourdough starter in the oven with the pilot light on. That has the chance of killing it. And if not killing it, it has the chance of allowing mold to develop. Now, once sourdough starters are well established, there's less chance of mold. However, as the sourdough starter gets in a more warm environment, you don't want to chance the development of bacteria and the killing of the good yeast that's made your beautiful starter. So you want to make sure that you never let your starter get into an environment where it's over 140 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, that said, even temperatures under that are still quite warm can hurt your starter. As I said, even in your oven with the pilot light on or the electric light on, maybe it's 110, 120, you're starting to get into a territory that it's going to make it difficult for your starter to proliferate, for the yeast to proliferate, and opens the door for bad bacteria to take over. So that is the first enemy, just letting it get too hot. You never want it to be exposed to 140 degrees Fahrenheit or warmer. And even a little bit under that, I would be very careful with it. The next problem is really neglecting your sourdough starter. It's one thing to overfeed it, underfeed it, skip a feeding, but if you leave this at room temperature and you've not taken the opportunity to dehydrate it for storage, you're just simply leaving it like this with the flour and water mixed in it and left on the counter for days and days and days on end, you're probably going to kill it. You've got to feed it. It's going to be hungry. So if you decide that you're in a situation where maybe you're going to go on vacation or you're not going to be baking bread, then you want to move on to the step where you refrigerate your starter or dehydrate it. Because if you just leave it on the counter like this, it's going to be subject to neglect, and then it's going to die. Bacteria may take over, and so on and so forth. So don't neglect your sourdough starter. You don't need to be perfect with it. It is surprisingly hardy, but you just can't neglect it on and on and on. Now, if you decide you're not ready to bake bread and you do want to store your sourdough starter, you can dehydrate it, and it's very easy to do. I have a video on that, and I'll put a link to it in the iCards. But basically, you just spread some out on parchment paper. You don't even really need a dehydrator. If you spread it thin enough, it'll dehydrate at room temperature, and then you just break it up in a lot of little bits of pieces. And then you can put it in a canning jar, maybe get all the oxygen out, and store it in your pantry. And then, like the gold miners, when you're ready to make bread, just break it up, add water, start feeding it, and reconstitute it. And it can take a couple of days, to get going again, but it should be fine. The next way that you can store it is right in your refrigerator. And what you want to do is you'll put it in the refrigerator, and you should probably take it out once a week and feed it. Now, if you go a little longer or a little shorter, it's not the end of the world. But if you can get into the habit of feeding it once a week, that'll be great. Now, if after 1 week, or even if you go a little longer than 1 week, you may find that a liquid starts developing on top. And that liquid is called hooch. And you may find that it has quite a strong aroma, possibly very, maybe vinegary or sour type smell versus the sort of yeasty, almost beer-like smell that you would become used to with your sourdough starter. And that hooch is not a problem. You can either drain it off, or if you like a very sour sourdough starter that makes a very sour sourdough bread, you can just mix the hooch right in. Now, it may be gray, it may be brown, it may be black, it can be an assortment of colors, but it's not harmful. And as I said, it's not killed your sourdough starter. Your sourdough starter is still alive. You just need to drain that off or mix it in and feed your sourdough starter to give it the nutrition that it needs. And then once you're ready to bake with your sourdough starter and you remove it from your refrigerator, if it's been a week or a bit longer, you'll just want to start feeding it again and give it a day or two to perk up and be ready to bake with. Often when you take it out of the refrigerator and feed it, it may not be ready for baking the next day. So if you can, try to plan a day or two to feed it and get it going again. But if your starter's only been in the fridge for maybe 3 or 4 days, you may be able to feed it the night before, or once you take it out of the refrigerator, feed it, leave it on your counter. You probably will be able to bake with it the next day. But usually if it's been in the fridge a week or longer, it does take a little more time to reactivate it. Now next, what if when you go to smell your sourdough starter, the aroma is not one of what you typically associate with a yeasty type smell? What if it smells very sour, or as some people have even described, like nail polish remover, like acetone? Now don't worry, nothing's gone wrong. What has happened is the bacteria acids, the good bacteria acids have become stronger than the yeasts. What's happened is that the bacteria that produces acetic acid, which is bacteria that also creates vinegar, has taken over and become stronger than the yeast. And so you're going to get that very strong acetic acid aroma, which is an acetone aroma. Your sourdough starter will still work and it'll still bake a beautiful loaf of bread. It's just that the taste of your sourdough bread is going to be more sour. Now, some people don't want a very sourdough bread. They want a more mild sourdough bread. So how do you correct that problem if your starter has now taken over, or the good bacteria that creates the acetic acid has taken over and is becoming stronger than the yeast? What do you do? The first thing that you can do is start feeding your starter more frequently. Maybe move up to 8 hours instead of every 12 hours. And the reason is that when you feed the starter more frequently, you're going to dilute, in essence, the bacteria acids that are creating that acetic acid aroma and flavor. And you're going to give the yeast a little boost, because the yeast with the frequent feedings will fare better and proliferate more than the bacteria acids. Now, that said, when you do these more frequent feedings, if you really want to give it a little help and give the yeast a little help, refrigerate it. And I know this sounds funny because it kind of goes against the rule of having your starter at that nice 70 to 80 degree Fahrenheit temperature. However, if you feed it and you keep feeding it every 8 hours, and then you put it in the refrigerator after each feeding, you actually help give the yeast a boost. Yes, the yeast loves the warm temperatures. However, in cold temperatures, yeast performs better or survives better than the bacteria, whether it's good bacteria or bad bacteria. So by refrigerating it, you give the yeast a little jump start over the bacteria, because it will be able to eat and proliferate a little faster, even though, yes, it's in the refrigerator and everything does slow down. It will proliferate a little quicker than the bacteria. And so that will help your starter get back to having that nice yeasty aroma that we associate with sourdough starters. Now, the next tip I want to share with you, in the event that your starter has taken on that nail polish remover, that acetone smell, is when you go to feed your starter, stir it as little as possible and then put your lid right on. And the reason is the acetic acid bacteria likes oxygen. It loves to be oxygenated. And that's why when we talk about making apple cider vinegar, which if that's something you're interested in, I'll put a link in the iCards above, that we stir it every day. And the reason is because that type of bacteria loves to be oxygenated. So if you just feed it, stir it only as much as necessary, cover it up, and let it be, it'll be less likely to help give that acetic acid bacteria the oxygenation that it needs. So hopefully this guide will get you started on creating a successful sourdough starter so that you can now make sourdough bread. Now that you've got your starter going, let's make sourdough bread. We're going to make a beautiful artisan sourdough boule, but I'm going to show you how easy it is to make. And there's no kneading involved, just a little stretch and fold, but it's a fast stretch and fold. You're not devoting your whole day to it. So this is an easy artisan sourdough boule that you're going to make time and time again. Let's get started. Now let's go over the ingredients for making this bread. You're going to need 3 cups of flour, which we're going to talk about in detail in a minute. You're going to need 1 1/4 cups of water. Room temperature is fine. You're going to need 1 cup of a well-fed starter, and you're going to need 1 1/2 teaspoons of a fine ground salt. I'm going to be using a fine ground sea salt. Now, to make this no-knead sourdough bread, you can use all-purpose flour or you can use bread flour, and both of these are commonly found at most grocery stores. All-purpose flour and bread flour both are milled from modern-day whole wheat. The only difference is they're just different types of modern-day whole wheat. The one that's made into bread flour has a higher protein or higher gluten, and gluten is what helps give bread a nice structure, a nice rise. And that's why the flour with more gluten, more protein, is called bread flour, because it's made for making bread. But all-purpose flour, as the name implies, it's all-purpose, can also work. But what these two types of flour have in common, all-purpose flour and bread flour, is that all of the bran and the germ that's contained in the whole wheat, the whole grain, has been sifted out. Now, you can also use all-purpose spelt flour or all-purpose einkorn flour. Spelt and einkorn are ancient grains, and they've become very common today, and you can often find a whole grain spelt flour or a whole grain einkorn flour for sale, but you may also find all-purpose spelt flour or an all-purpose einkorn flour. And these ancient grains, these ancient wheats, when they're sold in their all-purpose form, have also had the bran and the germ sifted out of them. Now, overall, spelt and einkorn contain less gluten. So if you decide to use all-purpose spelt flour or all-purpose einkorn flour, you can also consider adding in some vital wheat gluten. If gluten agrees with you, sometimes people choose to use the ancient grains because they are a little lower in gluten, although not gluten-free. That's important to note. But you can add a little vital wheat gluten into your flour to help boost the gluten and help boost the rise of making a no-knead sourdough spelt boule or making a no-knead sourdough einkorn boule. So I just wanted to give you that little overview so that you understand the difference between different types of flours. But using any type of all-purpose flour or bread flour works very well when making a sourdough bread. Now, you can certainly use any flour that you buy at your local grocery store, but what I like to do is actually store the whole grain and then grind my flour fresh. And I generally like to use spelt or sometimes einkorn, but I find spelt a very good all-purpose flour. I'll use my muck mill to grind my spelt grain, and then I'll use a baker's sifter like this. And these are very common. You can probably find them at a local kitchen store. They're also sold online at places like Breadtopia and King Arthur Flour. I've also seen them on Amazon. And they come in a different grades in terms of how tight the mesh is. They usually have numbers associated with them like 40, 50, 60, and those numbers indicate how tight this mesh is. But what I'll do is I'll go ahead and I'll grind my grain, and then if I want to turn my flour into what I can do as close as possible to an all-purpose flour, I'll put it in this sifter and I'll sift out as much bran and germ as I can. Now, do I get it as good as a commercially sifted flour? No. I think of it more as my old world flour. There probably is a little bit of bran and germ left in there, but primarily at least 3/4 of it is sifted out. Often what I'll do if I know I'm going to be doing a lot of baking, I'll grind a good amount of grain, and then I will sift out as much bran and germ as I can, and then I'll just decant it into a glass jar like I have here with a nice, good, tight, airtight seal. Now, generally, I don't keep a lot of whole grain flour on hand in its flour form because the bran and the germ can go rancid and give your flour an off flavor. However, this has had the bulk of the bran and the germ sifted out of it, and I'm definitely going to use this well within 6 months, which is sort of my cutoff when it comes to storing whole grain flour. Some people feel that it does stay fresh for a year. I like to primarily use my whole grain flour up within 6 months. Now, this is technically my all-purpose version, but I do know that it does have a little bit of bran and germ left in it, because even if you do home sift it, and I have a video where I go through this in a lot of detail where I'm grinding grain and sifting it to different consistencies, one where I sift out about a quarter of the bran and the germ, and then another where I sift out as much bran and germ as I can, and that's what I've got here. So this is my version of a spelt all-purpose flour, and that's what I'm going to be using to make my bread. And I'm just using the all-purpose spelt flour. I'm not adding anything else to it, so in the event that you also at home may not have the vital wheat gluten, you don't need to worry about it. You can see basically what a no-knead sourdough bread using an all-purpose flour, and in this case an all-purpose spelt flour, is going to look like. Chances are, if you're using an all-purpose flour from the grocery store or a bread flour that's been commercially sifted, you're probably going to get even a slightly better rise than I'm going to get. Now I've got 1 cup of my all-purpose spelt flour in here, and I'm just going to go ahead and get my other 2 cups. And I'm just, scooping it and then just leveling it off. I'm not doing anything fancy. Now to my flour, I'm going to go ahead and add in my salt, 1.5 teaspoons. Now, there are different schools of thought on this. Some people, when they're using yeast or a sourdough starter, prefer to allow the sourdough starter, the water, and the flour to just go through what's known as an autolyse, if I'm pronouncing that properly, autolyse property or procedure, without the salt added in. I actually think the proper pronunciation may be autolyse. You'll have to put it down in the comments for me phonetically. You know I'm the queen of mispronunciation. But in any event, I like to mix my salt right in with the flour. I don't notice a huge difference. Some people prefer to allow as I said, the flour, the water, and the sourdough starter to go through the autolyse process together, but without the salt, and then knead the salt into the dough after that autolyse process. I really, to be honest with you, I don't notice a big difference. And I also often wonder, am I getting the salt kneaded in well? So I don't worry about it, and I just go ahead and mix it right into the flour. I do make sure that I mix it in well and there are no clumps of salt. And I'm using my magic whisk. I love this little thing. It's such a good whisk. It does such a great job in whatever way you use it, and yet it's so small, but it works great. So I'm just going to get that salt mixed through, and then we'll move on to the next step. Now I'm just going to set that flour aside for a minute, and I'm going to get my water, and this is just room temperature water. I did use spring water. I find, with anything that's under the fermentation umbrella, whether it's a vegetable ferment or in this case a sourdough, I do like to give anything that I'm doing that involves some sort of fermentation process the best start that it can get. And I prefer not to use water that has chlorine in it because I don't want to have anything in this fermentation process that may inhibit a successful fermentation. So that's just me. The same with my salt. I just use a sea salt. Any plain salt you have that doesn't contain anti-caking agents or other chemicals is probably a good bet to use whenever you're doing any type of fermentation. And speaking of salt, I have a discount code for you also when you're over at that shopping guide if you like the Redmond Real salt. And that's a perfect salt to use when making sourdough bread or vegetable ferments. Well, I fed my sourdough starter yesterday and it's nice and bubbly. And I'm going to go ahead and just pour in 1 cup right into my measuring cup here. Now my sourdough starter is one that a long time ago was originally started with rye flour, but over time I really just fed it with whatever I had, and so I just want to share that with you so that you know you can also feed your starter with whatever you have if you started it with rye flour. And the reason I often recommend starting your starter with rye flour is that rye flour is a little easier to get a sourdough starter going because rye flour contains things that the yeast really like to gobble up. So that's just a little tip. And I have videos where I show you how to make a sourdough starter with rye flour, as well as a sourdough starter just using plain all-purpose flour. And I'll be sure to link to those in the description. But in any event, I've got my 1 cup of fed starter here. And as I said, I fed this yesterday, but it's nice and bubbly and ready to go. And I'm just going to go ahead and pour this right into my 1 1/4 cup of water. What I'm going to do now is just mix the sourdough starter in the water until it's fully dissolved and incorporated. Now I'm just going to make a well in my flour, and I'm going to go ahead and pour in my water sourdough starter mixture. Now I'm going to mix this with my hands, and I've wet them to make the job very easy. You could also use a spatula or a Danish dough whisk if you've got one of those, but eventually you're going to need to get in there a little bit with your hands. So I've just wet them at the beginning, and I'm going to go ahead and mix this with my hands. Alrighty, now this is going to be a very wet, sticky dough. That's the characteristic of a good no-knead bread, whether it's a yeast-risen bread or a sourdough bread. And if at any time you feel the dough is sticking too much to your hands, simply wet your hands again. And if you find that your dough is very dry, climate does play a role in all of this. And everybody's kitchen and everybody's climate is slightly different. You can add in a tablespoon at a time, or even a teaspoon of water, and see if that helps you get a good, nice, shaggy consistency. Now what we're going to do is cover this dough for 20 minutes, and we're just going to let it rest. This is the autolyse, if I'm saying that right, part of bread making. And this is where, the water and the flour and the sourdough starter and the salt, they just sort of all come together and relax a little, and the flour gets nicely saturated with the moisture. And so you just want to do this. Often you'll hear 30 minutes with a no-knead sourdough bread that has so much moisture to it. I find you really only need about 20 minutes, and then it's going to be very easy to handle. Well, we've let this rest for 20 minutes, and now what we're going to do is use the stretch and fold method, which can really help lighten your no-knead sourdough breads if you've found them to be dense in the past. Now, I like to use wet hands for this process, and the reason is, as I mentioned earlier, no-knead sourdough bread dough is on the wet and sticky side, shaggy as they say, and so I don't like to introduce a lot of flour. So I'm going to go ahead and use wet hands, and I think that this should work well. Now, with the stretch and fold method, what you're going to be doing is basically, as the name implies, you're going to stretch the dough up towards you, and then you're simply going to fold it over itself. Stretch and fold. Then all we're going to do is turn our bowl a quarter turn, and we're going to do the same thing. We're going to, with our wet hands, we're going to stretch the dough up to us and fold it over itself. And then again, another turn. We're gonna stretch the dough up to us, and we're gonna fold it over itself. And then another quarter turn, and we're gonna stretch our dough up towards us and fold it over itself. Then another quarter turn, and we're just going to end up where we started. And we're gonna, one more time, we're gonna stretch our dough up to us and fold it over. So that was a total of 5 stretch and folds. One at the 12 o'clock mark, one at the, 3 o'clock mark, one at the 6 o'clock mark, one at the 9 o'clock mark, and then another one when we got back to the 12 o'clock mark. Now, we're going to cover our dough and we're going to let this rest for 15 minutes. After 15 minutes, we're going to do another stretch and fold. The first one we did with 5 stretch and folds is called a set. So we're going to do a total of 5 sets of stretch and fold. So one time around the bowl with 5 stretch and folds, wait 15 minutes. Another time, 5 times around the bowl, stretch and fold, wait 15 minutes. Another 5 times around the bowl, stretch and fold, wait 15 minutes. So far that's 3 sets. Then you're going to do your 4th set, 5 times around the bowl of stretch and fold, wait 15 minutes, and then your final 5 times around the bowl of stretch and fold, and that's your 5th set. After your 5th set, your last stretch and fold set, then what you're going to do is coat your dough with a little bit of olive oil. That's what I like to do. And then you're going to cover it with plastic wrap, and you're going to set it aside to rest the fermentation stage for 12 hours. I like to do this in the evening because the fermentation process is going overnight, and then I can proceed with baking my bread in the morning. But if the reverse works for you, that's great too. But if this 12-hour schedule doesn't work for you, don't worry. You can cover this again doing the same process that we've done here with our stretch and folds, and then coat it with some olive oil, put some plastic wrap on top, set it aside for just 1 hour at room temperature. After 1 hour, put it in your refrigerator. You can leave this in your refrigerator anywhere from 18 to 24 hours. When you're ready to bake your bread, you're simply going to pull it out of your refrigerator, let it let it warm up to room temperature, and then proceed with the rest of the steps for baking your sourdough bread. However, if you find you're in a situation where you've gone past the 24 hours, please do not throw out your dough. It's going to work just fine using it to make a pizza dough or a focaccia or any sort of flatbread. After 24 hours, it's going to be more difficult to get a good rise out of it to make a boule, which is what we're going to make, one of those nice round sourdough breads. So know that you have some flexibility. You can do the 12 hours on the counter at room temperature, or you can do the 18 to 24 hours in your refrigerator. Well, I let this ferment overnight, and now I'm going to remove the plastic and show you that the dough has basically doubled in size. But now I don't want you to get concerned about, well, what exactly does doubled in size mean? I know a lot of times when you're a new baker, that can be somewhat confusing. Is it doubled in size? Is it not doubled in size? Basically, a trick that I'll tell you, what you're looking for is your dough to be slightly domed and basically looking like a little bit of a puffy pillow. The first thing you want to do is get some type of flat surface. I've just got a typical baking sheet here. And on that flat surface, put a piece of parchment paper and then dust it with flour and then set it aside. Then I'm going to reach in here and you want to get a little bit of flour, not too much. Remember, this is a no knead. We want it to kind of be a wet dough, but a little bit of flour will help us to keep that sticky wet dough from sticking to our work surface. The next thing you want to do is remove your dough from your bowl and transfer it to your work surface. I really like doing this with a little plastic bench scrape. These are very reasonable. You can find them almost at any kitchen store, or probably in the aisle where they sell kitchen products at your grocery store. It's only a couple of dollars, and this works very well. Alternatively, you can wet your hands and scoop the dough out as well. But you'll see this bench scrape, look at how beautiful this looks. Look at how, see, it just takes it right out and kind of punches it down at the same time. Alrighty, now we're just going to transfer that right down onto our work surface. Perfect. Now you can use wet hands, or you can sprinkle your dough with a little bit of flour. I'm just going to use a little bit of flour. The dough is nice and wet, so I'm not too worried about the flour. If your dough seems a little more on the drier side, then use wet hands. And I'm just going to flour my hands a little too. What we want to do is just flatten this down. It's not difficult to do at all. Just flatten it until you get it about the size of like a piece of paper, about 8.5 by 11. Next, once you get it flattened out, you're basically pulling one side up and bringing it down into the middle. Then you're going to take your other side, the long end, and bring that up and over. Now you have your nice little folded letter. Now that I've got this nicely folded, I'm just going to flip it over. And then what I'm going to do is take my hands and cup this into the point where I can make it into a ball. So I'm just going to start working like this. And once I got that flipped over, I'm just continuing to just work it around until I get a nice smooth ball and a nice smooth top. And if you see any bubbles that appear, you can just press that air out. But basically what you're trying to do is just create a nice smooth top and some tension. Now we're going to use our bench scrape to lift this up and put it down onto our flat surface. Mine is with parchment paper and it's floured. Then I'm going to get a little flour out of here and I'm just going to dust the top of this, and you'll see why in a minute. That'll be lovely. And then I'm going to take my dish towel and I'm going to cover this. And I'm just going to put this, whoops, it's sliding. I'm just going to put this right here. It's a nice, warm, cozy spot. I'm going to take my clean dish towel that's dusted with flour so nothing should stick, and I'm just going to cover this, and I'm going to let this rise for about an hour or two. How long this is going to take really depends on the temperature in your kitchen, the weather outside. There are so many factors involved when you're making bread, especially sourdough bread. But I'll keep an eye on this and check on it in an hour, maybe 2. While your dough is rising, you want to get a Dutch oven with a lid and with a stainless steel knob or some type of knob that can withstand 500 degrees Fahrenheit in your oven. I know it can get confusing when people might say a 4-quart Dutch oven, 5-quart Dutch oven, 6-quart Dutch oven. I use between a 5-quart and a 6-quart Dutch oven, and basically mine measures, if I measure across the opening, measures 10 inches, so hopefully that'll help you. You want to place your Dutch oven with the lid on into your oven on the middle rack, and you want to preheat your oven with the Dutch oven in the oven at 500 degrees Fahrenheit. And you want both your oven and the Dutch oven to become very hot. So you want to do this about 45 minutes before you're ready to bake your bread. Now I know you may not know exactly if it's going to take an hour or an hour and a half or 2 hours for your dough to rise, but just estimate best you can. If you wind up just heating it for 30 minutes or you wind up heating it for an hour, either way, it's going to work out okay. You just want to make sure that you have hit that 500 degrees Fahrenheit mark on your oven and your Dutch oven is in there and it's been in there for a while. Well, I let my dough rise for about an hour and a half. I felt that looked like it had about doubled in size. Now, again, I know the doubling in size, it can become a little confusing. You can always do something that's called a poke test, but I know that can be confusing as well. However, what you'll do if you want to do the poke test is take your finger and quickly stick it into your dough just up to the first knuckle. And you want to do it quickly. Stick it in, pull it out quickly. If the indentation stays where it is or starts to move back slowly, your dough is sufficiently proofed. If the dough springs back really fast, then it's not risen enough. And so what you want to do is give it about another 15 minutes or so. However, I want to say something about the poke test. I know it can be confusing to the new baker. Is it moving a little? Is it moving back quickly? And it can become a little overwhelming. And some will even say that if you do the poke test and the dough just stays still and isn't moving back slowly, your dough has overproofed. But it's not the end of the world. If you shape your dough, you put it on your parchment paper, and you give it somewhere between 1 hour to 2 hours to double, to what looks to the human eye, double in size or about double in size, you're going to be fine. If it's a little overproofed, if it's a little underproofed, it's not going to make a significant difference in the long run. We're not professional bakers. We're home bakers. And a little bit one way or the other, as I said, isn't going to make a significant difference in the final product. All anyone is going to know is that you made homemade bread. Now what I'm going to do is go in here and just sprinkle the top of my dough here with some flour. And then I'm going to put a little flour carefully on my paring knife here. Now, you could just put this right into the oven as is and not worry about scoring it. It will crack in order to release steam, and it'll just crack in whatever pattern the bread decides it's going to crack. Or you can use a very sharp knife or something known as a lame, pronounced like mom but with an L, a lame, and that's a tool that has a handle to it but with a razor blade on the end, so it's very sharp, and it allows you to make your own cuts. Some people you'll see become very creative and are very good at doing lovely designs. As a beginner, I highly recommend that you simply just make sort of maybe one half semicircle cut or a cross on top of the bread. What I'm going to do is just make a very basic cross, and I've floured this on top, and I've floured my little paring knife here just so that nothing sticks. So all you have to do is take your sharp paring knife or your lame and start gently working your way across the top of your dough and make the cross. Try not to pull it or drag it. That's why the lame is very popular, because it's such a sharp razor blade that it very easily cuts into the dough. But you can do it with a sharp paring knife too, so I don't want you to worry. Just try to use sort of the tip of the knife and just move across very gently, not in any way pulling the dough. You don't want to do, or putting any pressure. You don't want to deflate it. You just want to gently make your mark to allow the steam to escape. Now I'm going to go ahead and get my Dutch oven out of the oven. Now this is going to be piping hot, so be very careful. When you pick up the lid, first of all, I want to mention, put it down onto a heat-proof surface. I just use an old cotton pot holder that works great. But if you have some other type of heat-proof surface, that's fine too. Now, open the pot away from you because steam may escape. Alrighty. Now, let me put this down over here. Very hot. This is where the parchment paper comes in very handy. We're going to go ahead and we're going to pick up our dough, and we're going to put that right down into our Dutch oven. Okay, now that we've got that in the Dutch oven, we're going to use our pot holder, and we're going to put the lid on, and we want to make sure that when we put the lid on that we have all of the parchment paper tucked in. And yes, we do. Now we're going to go ahead and put this back into the oven, and we're going to put it on the middle shelf, right where we had it set when we were preheating the oven, but we want to lower the heat to 475 degrees Fahrenheit. Now we're going to bake that bread at 475 degrees Fahrenheit for 30 minutes. And at 30 minutes, we're going to open the oven, remove the lid, and let the bread continue baking without the lid on. Well, this no-knead sourdough bread looks glorious. This was in the oven covered for 30 minutes at 475 degrees Fahrenheit. And then after 30 minutes, I removed the lid and let it bake uncovered for just a few more minutes. It really didn't need very much. It already was a nice golden brown when I took the lid off. So now I'm going to carefully, the parchment paper has cooled a bit with the lid off, and it's sitting here on my board so I can lift it up. But be careful, because initially the parchment paper will still feel warm. Now I'm just going to let this sit here for a few minutes. I think I can touch it. Yeah, it's cooled off a little bit. I'm just going to move that parchment paper out of the way, and I'm going to let this cool, and we'll slice it and we'll see how the interior came. Now this bread definitely looks very well done to me, but if you're new to baking, all you need to do is put it up on its side and tap it on the bottom. And I'll lean in so hopefully you can hear this with the mic. Hear that? Nice hollow sound. Means it's well baked and it's finished. Well, I let this cool about 20 minutes. It's still warm, but let's just go ahead and slice it and see how it turned out. Oh, listen to that. It sounds wonderful. Oh, look at this. Oh, it is quite warm, but look at how beautiful this bread came. Well, I know you're going to be so pleased with how this bread turns out. It's got a wonderful crisp exterior, yet the interior is so soft, so light, not dense in the least. So I think you're going to love doing the stretch and fold to get this lovely texture if you've had some problems with no-knead sourdoughs in the past. Well, now let's put some butter on this and give it a taste. Well, I've got some softened butter here because we gotta have some butter on this type of bread. Alrighty, let's give this a taste. Mmm. 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 That is such a delicious bread. This is not the least bit dense. You're going to be so pleased with this. Well, you've learned how to make a sourdough starter, and you've learned how to make a beautiful sourdough artisan boule. But sometimes do you feel, gee, I'm not so sure I really want to maintain a starter. I'm not so sure I want to make sourdough bread. If you fall into that category, I have something for you that I like to call the sourdough secret, or also known, as my girlfriend often shared with me, this is the busy mother's sourdough bread. And it's a wonderful, easy bread to master and a very easy sourdough starter, shall we say, to get going and then to maintain. And it's, there's a little secret here. So let's get started making our busy mother's sourdough. Now, I can't take credit for this very clever idea. This was developed by a girlfriend of mine many years ago. We were homeschool mothers together, and she was definitely a busy mother. She had 6 children, but she really was very devoted to making the transition from a processed foods kitchen to a traditional foods kitchen. And she wanted to be able to incorporate sourdough bread into her family's diet. But so many times she'd try to start the starter and it wouldn't work out, or she'd forget to feed it, or she'd finally get it going and put it, get ready to make her bread and have her dough. And then she would get distracted because she had to take her kids somewhere or do this, that, or the other thing. And then the dough would overrise and sink. It was always one problem after another. But then she got an idea. She came across a book which at the time was new, but now there have been many versions of this book. And it was the book, Bread in 5 Minutes a Day. But she thought, what if I make the dough as is described in that book, which we're going to go over today. But instead of using so much yeast, I use just a very tiny little pinch of yeast. And then I put everything in the refrigerator, and let's see what happens. Well, that's what we're going to do today, and we're going to see what happens. Well, what my friend theorized was, could she mix all of this together, put it in a plastic container, and then not worry about it and just put it in her refrigerator, and then when she had the time to bake bread, take out as much as she wanted to make a loaf or a couple of rolls, whatever the case may be, give them time to rise, bake them, and be done with it, not have to worry about scheduling everything so perfectly, about the rise, you know, the mixing and the rising and then the punching down and the rising and so on and so forth. And what she learned was that, in fact, yes, you could do that. And this was all outlined in the book, Bread in 5 Minutes a Day. But she wanted to take this one step further and experiment. What if she put 3½ cups of flour, 1½ cups of water, these other ingredients, the salt, the sugar, and a little bit of yeast, in here, let it rise in the fridge, pulled it out to bake, and took 3 cups of the dough, or a little more, whatever the case may be, to make her loaf of bread, and left enough in her little bin that was maybe equal to about 1/2 cup. And with that 1/2 cup, she then went and added 3 cups of flour and 1 cup of water, and maybe a pinch of sugar, a pinch of salt. No more yeast though. Mixed it all up with that little bit of dough ball that she had left in there and put that in the fridge. Would that be enough to allow the next set of dough be able to be turned into a nice loaf of bread? And what she discovered was, yes, it was sufficient. And then she further theorized that over time, it slowly took on yeasts that were just in the air in her kitchen and became her busy mother's sourdough starter. Because she never added any more yeast. She just fed it once a week with more flour and water, giving her some dough, ready to bake bread or rolls or whatever the case may be. She went on to double the recipe often in a bigger container, never adding any more yeast, just leaving that about 1/2 cup of dough in there, scraping down the dried sides on her container, leaving the lid off while she'd be working in the kitchen, hoping some natural yeast would be coming in there. And what she found over time, the taste of her bread started to mature, the texture started to mature, it looked more like sourdough, tasted more like sourdough. So as far as she was concerned, it was sourdough. And I think that this can be a wonderful solution if you have been struggling with trying to make a sourdough starter or sourdough bread. Well, to try this method, what you're going to need is some flour. It can be all-purpose flour or it can be bread flour. But I really recommend just starting with plain flour, not a whole grain flour. In future videos, we'll talk about how to transition this and do this with whole grain flours. But just to get this going, I highly recommend you use something just very simple and plain. Next, you're going to need 1.5 teaspoons of salt. I've just got a plain fine ground sea salt here, but use whatever you have. And then I've got 1 tablespoon of sugar. This is an organic unbleached sugar, but again, use whatever you have in your kitchen. And if you have made the transition to a traditional foods kitchen and you are incorporating whole sugars into your diet, you can certainly use the dried cane juice known by the name sucanat or anything along those lines. Maple sugar will work, date sugar would work, any type of sweetener. You just need a little something. And then you're just going to want 1/4 teaspoon of yeast. And this can be active dry yeast or instant yeast. It doesn't matter. And next you're going to need about 1.5 cups of water. And this can just be plain tap water. Don't worry about it being hot or cold. It doesn't matter. Room temperature is fine. And you're going to need one more thing, and that's some type of container. This is just a plastic food-grade Rubbermaid container, and I like using these type because they're easy to put in my refrigerator, and we're going to be putting all of this into our refrigerator. But if you have a flat plastic container, again, that's food safe, that's fine, or a glass container, that's fine too, whatever you want to work with. It just needs to be large enough to hold 3½ cups of flour and 1½ cups of water and room to stir it all together, and it has to have some kind of cover on it. Now the first thing that we're going to do is, to our water, we're just going to go ahead and add in our sugar, and then we're going to go ahead and add in our yeast. And don't worry if it's just room temperature, it doesn't need to be so warm. We just need to mix that up before we go ahead and add it into our little bucket here. Now I'm using active dry yeast. If you're using instant yeast, you can go ahead and put everything into your container in one fell swoop. You can add in your flour, your salt, your sugar, your instant yeast, give it a real good mixing, and then add in your water. But since I'm using active dry yeast, I'm going to dissolve it first in water with a little sugar. And if you want a discussion of the differences between instant yeast and active dry yeast, I cover that in another video, and I'll be sure to link to that. So if you want to watch, and I'll put the timestamp in so you can watch that discussion. But all you need to know is you can use either or here. Now I'm just using the little plastic measuring cup that came with my flour container. And this is very forgiving, so don't worry, you don't need to be super exact. But I'm just going to go ahead and measure out my 3 cups. We're going to put a total of 3½ cups in here. And then that's just my final ½ cup of flour. Then we'll go ahead and get our salt in there. And we'll just give this a real good whisk around just to make sure we get that salt very well distributed throughout the flour. And I just want to mention, I'm not worried. I just wanted to mix this yeast throughout the water with the sugar, but I'm really not worried about the whole blooming process. My yeast is well within its expiration date, and the only reason that I'm mixing it with the water is to just make sure that it's well distributed, since it is an active dry yeast. I just want to get the little bit out of the bottom there, because I know many of you have told me that you really don't even worry about blooming or mixing your active dry yeast with water if you know that it's well within the expiration date. You use it very similar to the way you do instant yeast, and you just throw it right in. So that definitely is an option if you're comfortable doing that. Then I'm going to take a wooden spoon, and I'm just going to start mixing this right in the container. Now, you want this to be very wet and shaggy. The wetter the dough, the better. So if you feel that it's too dry, by all means add more water. Now the consistency of the dough that you're looking for should be very wet and shaggy like this. And I'm going to take a close-up video so that you can see what this dough is like. Very wet like that. See how that's just fallen right off the spoon. Then just clean off any extra dough that's on your spoon and get that down into your container. A little bit of a sticky wicket, but I don't like to waste anything. And then we'll go ahead and move on to the next step. Next, all we need to do is put our lid on, and it doesn't need to be super tight. This doesn't need to be an airtight container, nothing like that. Even in this case, I'm just going to kind of leave this corner a little loose there. And now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to put this in my refrigerator. And I'm just going to leave it there for a day or two, and then I'll bring it out, I'll show you how the dough looks, and we'll proceed with making bread, and then we'll try to make another batch of dough to put in the fridge, and then over time I'll follow up with future videos showing how the texture and the taste of the bread changes over time to being more of a true sourdough. Well, I left this in my refrigerator for 2 days, and I am so impressed with all the beautiful bubbles that have formed in this dough. And I'll take pictures and I'll overlay them from the front and the side here. Beautiful bubbles. And it's amazing just from that little tiny bit of yeast. And the aroma is quite lovely, not the least bit heavily yeasty or over yeasty. It's just a very, very mild aroma. Well, now let's take out about 3 cups worth and we'll make a loaf of bread. The first thing I'm going to do is just flour my board, but very lightly. I don't think we want to get too much flour into this dough because we do want to keep it very wet, because apparently keeping it very wet is what really helps make a lot of that carbon dioxide gas, which is what creates all those wonderful bubbles. And hopefully now having a little bit of flour on my hands will make getting this out a little easier. So as you'll see, this is very wet and gloopy. Now what I did was I kept scissors handy just in case I had trouble pulling off that little bit that I want to leave left in there. And that's actually, it's not quite a cup. I'm going to add a little more. But I think my friend was never particularly super exact about it. She would just leave maybe somewhere between the size of a golf ball and a baseball. So maybe a half a cup. She wasn't really exact about it, which is kind of what I really like about this. Now it's very wet and gooey, but you should be able to pull your hand off of it. There'll be some dough that'll stick, but it's really not too bad. So let's try and just shape this. The nice thing is, this is no knead. So all we need to do is just get enough flour on our hands to just do the tuck and shape method, so to speak, where we're just going to shape this into a ball. Now what can really help with this process is having a little plastic bench scrape like this, or if you don't have it, don't worry, a spatula, if you have a little plastic spatula, that'll work well too. But I'm just trying to get a little more flour on my hands here, but not overdo it, and scoop it out like that. And just try to shape this, just that little shape and tuck method. It's quite sticky. I'm resisting the urge to put too much flour, but I just keep flouring my hands and trying to tuck this little ball under without picking it up. It seems like when you pick it up, it's just a little too wet. But doing like this is working well. And I just want to get it into a nice smooth ball. Now, one thing I want to mention, if you have a pizza peel and a baking stone, you can do what I just did right now on my board on your pizza peel. And then when we get ready to bake this, you can just shake it off your pizza peel and put it into right onto your baking stone. But I know a lot of folks may not have a pizza peel and a baking stone, so the other options are you can just take a baking sheet, put down some parchment paper or aluminum foil, whatever you want, or you could even just bake it right on your baking sheet. But what you want to make sure that you do is put down a little cornmeal or a little flour so nothing sticks, and then you can use that to bake it with. Another option is you can go ahead and do the Dutch oven method with this bread. You can put it on parchment paper and lower it down into your hot Dutch oven and bake it with the cover on and bake it that way. Or if you want, you can just plop it right down into your hot Dutch oven. Some of you have asked me, do you really need to use the parchment paper? And the answer is no. The original method of that Dutch oven bread by Sullivan Street Bakery, they didn't use the parchment paper. They were just dumping it right into the hot Dutch oven. The parchment paper is really basically, I don't want to say invented, but started primarily by home cooks who were a little nervous having to get their dough and drop it down into that hot Dutch oven. So, but you can do it either way. But I thought that the easiest way would be to do this on the baking sheet, because most folks have a baking sheet. And if not, you can take a couple of sheets of aluminum foil and sort of turn it into a mock baking sheet and bake it like that. So I've got my baking sheet over here, and I've just got a piece of parchment paper on that, and I'm just going to try to pick up my little dough ball here best I can and get that onto there, nicely shaped. And now we're going to let that rise for about an hour. And my girlfriend never covered hers, so I'm just going to leave it uncovered. But if you feel more comfortable to cover it, you could use a dish towel and just make sure that it's brushed with a little flour so it doesn't stick. Now, a couple of tips. Number one, I understand that you may not see a lot of rise out of your bread, but don't worry about that. It should get a little bit of rise, a little bit of what they call the oven spring, when you put it into the oven. And speaking of the oven, you'll want to preheat your oven to 450 degrees Fahrenheit 20 minutes before you're ready to put your dough in. So as this is rising for that hour, 20 minutes before that hour comes to an end, be sure to preheat your oven to 450 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, I have a very small oven, so I tend to bake my breads in the lower third of my oven, because if I put breads on the middle rack, they're actually very close to the top heating element, and I find that they can brown too quickly. So that's just a little tip I want to share with you. If you have a very small oven like me, you may want to put your rack in the lower third of your oven. But if you have a big oven and you're used to baking breads and so on and so forth on your middle rack and everything comes out fine, then that's great. Now we come to the fun part. I have in here maybe about a half a cup of the dough, and that's just what you want. You just want to have some in there to help give our next stage a nice boost. And what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and add in our 3 cups of flour. We're just going to do 3 cups because basically we've got more or less that half cup of dough in there. And this is my 3rd cup of flour. Alrighty, so we've got that. And now I'm going to go ahead and add in 1 tablespoon of sugar, very much like we did the first time around. I'm going to do this just until I feel this gets established. Once I feel that I'm seeing a nice rise in my container and a lot of nice bubbles, I'll pull back on the sugar and I'll just let the yeast that's growing in here eat the flour, and you'd get its nutrition from the flour, and no longer add in the sugar. Because sometimes if you add too much sugar, you can encourage the growth of good bacteria. Now that's not necessarily a bad thing, because both the yeast and good bacteria can rise your bread, but there are taste differences, as opposed to if you have the natural yeast, which we're hoping to encourage to grow in here, rise our bread, versus the good bacteria. And this time around, I'm going to add just 1 teaspoon, not the 1½ teaspoons of salt. And the reason for that is, since we do have about a half a cup or so of the dough left in here, which has some salt in it, I don't want to add too much salt. So I'm just going to go ahead and put that 1 teaspoon in there. And then to start, I'm going to add about a 1½ cups of water. And this is just plain room temperature water, and that's just about 1½ cups. We'll see how it goes. It may need more. If it's very dry, we may need to add more water, because you do want this to be a very wet dough. If for any reason we added too much water and it's too soupy, we can always add an extra flour. It's very forgiving. Now, if you have one of those Danish dough whisks, you can get in there and mix this up, or you can just use a wooden spoon. Or if you watch Artisan Bread with Steve, he always likes to use the handle of his wooden spoon, and I think that's going to work best for this type of preparation. So I'm just going to get in here and mix this best I can. Well, this is mixing up nicely, but it's a little drier than I would like. So I'm going to go ahead and just add a smidge more water, just maybe about 1/4 cup or less. And I'll continue mixing it till I get to the consistency that I like, and I'll show you how it looks. Well, I think that little extra bit of water was perfect. And I'll overlay a video so that you can see. It's hard it's hard scooping. It's easy mixing it with the handle of the wooden spoon, but it's a little hard scooping some out. But I want to show you how wet this dough is. And I think that's perfect. Now I'm just going to clean off the handle of my spoon And then we'll put the lid on and we'll pop this in the refrigerator. So I'm going to put my lid on, again, not airtight. I'm actually going to leave this little one on the end a little loose. And I'm going to go ahead, put this back in my refrigerator, and we'll check on it in another day or two. And we'll see if we got any bubbles and how things are going. And maybe we'll make another loaf of bread and see if there's a significant difference between our first loaf. But the bottom line is, with this bread, or with this dough and with this method, hopefully over time, we are creating a sourdough starter, and one that may be a little easier than the ones where you've tried just doing flour and water on your counter and hoping for the best. We are cheating a little, starting off with a little bit of packaged yeast, but you know, sometimes when you're on this continuum of moving from a processed foods kitchen to a traditional foods kitchen, and there is a particular area of traditional foods that you're struggling with, sometimes it's nice to get a little helping hand and maybe just start with a little bit of packaged yeast, in our case just a quarter of a teaspoon, and then over time, hopefully you've got a good sourdough starter going. Well, my oven just came up to 450 degrees Fahrenheit, so we'll get ready to put our dough, which has been rising for an hour, into the oven, and hopefully it'll come out great. Now, I just want to give you one tip. If you're doing it like me, right here on a baking pan, but you want to try to mimic the Dutch oven effect, the steam that is created by putting your bread into the Dutch oven, you can take a little pan and put it on the lowest rack in your oven, an oven-safe pan, and fill it with some water. And just some water, I've got my tea kettle over there, just some water that you've warmed in your tea kettle, and pour, as you open your oven, pour it into that pan. It'll start to create some steam. Then put your bread in on your rack, close your door, and hope for the best. Well, I've got my bread in the oven, and it's going to bake for 30 minutes at 450 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, you might wonder why I just put the bread in straight away as it was. I didn't slash the top. And the reason is I decided to just let it crack basically wherever it wants to give it the most rustic look. That's what my friend used to do. But if you have a lame, that's the little razor blade for cutting bread, or just a very sharp knife, you can certainly make some slashes in it with any design that you want and let it bake like that. And I also want to say that everyone's oven is slightly different. So even though technically we're going to bake the bread for 30 minutes, I highly recommend taking a little peek at your bread at about 25 minutes. And if it looks done, if the top is nice and golden brown, and you take it out of the oven, and when you tap it on the bottom it sounds hollow, you're good to go. Your bread is baked. However, if you find that it is browning on top, but it turns out to not sound hollow, and you need to bake it a little longer, but you feel that it's gotten already golden brown enough and you're worried about it getting too dark on top, you can just cover it with a little bit of an aluminum foil tent, and continue to allow it to bake for the remaining 5 minutes so that the interior bakes, but that the top doesn't get too brown. Well, this turned out to be a lovely loaf of bread. I had it in for 30 minutes. Now, it didn't split or anything, which is very interesting. And it did have some bubbles on top, right on top of the dough. And I noticed them when I was putting them in the oven. And I was thinking, maybe I should just take a little toothpick and deflate some of them, but then I forgot. But it turned out okay. I think they're going to be probably kind of a little fun and crunchy on the top. But something that I want to mention is I did tent this with aluminum foil part way through the baking, because I checked it and I noticed, and it was those little bubbles, they were browning quite quickly. But also the loaf was browning relatively quickly. Now, I have a very small oven, and I did have it on the lower third rack, but it still was browning quickly. So I might lower the temperature to 425 degrees Fahrenheit, or maybe even 400 degrees Fahrenheit. I'm going to experiment with the next loaf we do and see how that comes out. But for now, I'm quite pleased, even with having to tent it. But I wanted to let you know about that, so that if you do this, keep an eye on it. And if you have a small oven, probably in a bigger oven, it won't be as much of a problem. But I have like the smallest wall oven they make. So just keep an eye on it. And you don't want it to burn on top. So you may have to tent it. Well, this is still quite hot, but hopefully you can hear with the microphone. It's got a nice top to it, and oh, the bottom sounds nice and hollow. So that's perfect. I'm going to transfer this now to a cooling rack. We'll let it cool completely, then we'll slice it. Well, I let this cool for a little bit, but it's still warm. I think it's hard to resist warm homemade bread, so we'll go ahead and slice into it. And I'm going to go right down the middle, and then I'll open it up so we can see exactly how the crumb came. Well, this looks quite lovely. It's very warm. But I'm quite pleased. You figure for a 1/4 teaspoon of yeast and in the dough left in the fridge for a couple of days. Oh, it smells nice. I'll take some close-up shots so that you can see exactly what it looks like. You will see, yeah, these were the little air bubbles that I talked about that I didn't pop before it went in, but yeah, that's okay. But I think it came quite lovely. Well, I'm going to cut a slice here and we'll give it a taste. Oh, I really love how soft the interior is. It's quite hot. It's very tasty. I'm really pleased. Now, we've got our second batch of the Busy Mother sourdough starter in the fridge. I'm going to leave it in there for a couple of days, and then we'll take it out and we'll see, without having added any extra yeast, if that little bit of dough that we left in there and then mixed in more flour and water and sugar and salt was able to rise and get some bubbles in there. And then we'll bake one more loaf and we'll see how that comes. Well, I left this second batch in the refrigerator for 3 days, and I'm very impressed with what I see. It's definitely risen. There's a lot of bubbles in here, and I'll overlay pictures, close-up pictures, so that you can see this both from the front angle here as well as the side angle. But it's loaded with bubbles, so that's definitely a good sign. Now I want to see how the aroma is. Oh, it smells wonderful. Mildly yeasty, but definitely not overpowering. Definitely closer to when you have a nice sourdough as opposed to a heavily yeasted dough where you've used commercial yeast. I'm also going to take a picture of the top looking down into this so that you can see up close. Now, I don't know how well it's going to show on the camera, but there are a lot of little bubbles on top, and they're not super translucent, so it may be a little difficult to see, but it's very bubbly on top. It's like bubbles that are like little air pockets that are coming up. Now what I'm going to do today is I'm just going to flour my board, and I'm going to take some of that dough out and make another loaf of bread. I won't walk you through all of that since we did that earlier in the video, but I will show you what the bread looks like at the end, and we can compare and contrast, at least with pictures, from our first bread. And then in a future video, as I nurse this along and keep it going, I'll see how it goes, assuming that if it continues to stay like this and create nice breads, I'll definitely do a follow-up video, maybe like a month or so from now, so that we can do a true evaluation of this process. Well, I took out some of the dough and I shaped a little loaf, and I left in maybe about a half a cup. It's hard to tell exactly, but I took a picture so you could see what's in here, and it was really wet. It was a really wet dough when I took it out. So I floured my board, and then I floured my hands real well, and I used my bench scrape to get this into some semblance of a loaf. But it was relatively easy to work with, but it is definitely a very wet, shaggy dough, but not unlike, you know, a lot of your typical no-kneads. So now what we're going to do is just like we did last time, we're going to put 3 cups of flour in here. And I'm still going to continue to add a bit of sugar. So I've got that 1 tablespoon of sugar. I'm going to sprinkle that in, and then 1 teaspoon of salt. And then I'm going to take about 1.5 cups of water. And this is just plain room temperature water. Then I'm going to take the handle of my wooden spoon, and I'm just going to mix this up like we did last time. Well, I've got this all mixed up, and I even used my bench scrape to try and scrape down a little bit of the dried dough from the side, and it's the same consistency as last time. I'll overlay a little video so hopefully you can see that, but yeah, it's just this same wet, shaggy dough. Well, now this is all ready to go back into my fridge, and on this second batch, I had left it in the refrigerator for 3 days. So now on this third batch, I may let it go a week and see how it does and see if I can still bake a loaf of bread with it. So if someone was a very busy mother and they didn't get to it for a week, how would it be? That'll be interesting to see. So I'm going to go ahead and put this in the fridge. Well, I've got the dough on my parchment-lined baking sheet. Now I'm going to let it rise in a warm, cozy place. Then we'll bake it, and I'll show you how it looks. Well, I baked up this bread, and I've got to tell you, I'm really surprised. This was the second batch that we took out of the refrigerator that I had left in there from 3 days ago. And we added no more yeast that second time around. We just added the flour, the sugar, and the salt. And this got a pretty good rise. Now, I want to tell you that I preheated my oven to 450 degrees Fahrenheit, and then I went ahead and put the dough in. I had it on the lower third of my oven where I like to bake my bread. And I forgot to lower it down to 425 because if you remember, I told you that it browned up a little too quickly. And so for the next time I was going to lower it, experiment and lower it to 425. Well, I forgot till it was in there for about 10 minutes. And what happened was this spot right here definitely got a little over browned. This is one of those bubbles. And so I quickly lowered my oven to 425 and tented my bread. So I just want to give you a heads up on all of this. As you're experimenting with this Busy Mother sourdough, monitor it and learn your oven and learn how this bread bakes up in your oven because you may find that it browns quicker than you expect it to. Well, now let's cut this down the middle and I'll show it to you. And then what I'll do is I'll get the picture from the last loaf we made, which was the very first loaf, and I'll try to put it side by side so that you can compare it to how this loaf looks, and we'll see what direction we're moving in. Alrighty, here we go. Whoops, oh my gosh, it looks great. Look at this. I'm really impressed. Well, I'll take some close-up pictures and I'll overlay them so that you can see this bread as is. And then what I'll do is, as I said, I'll try to put it side by side with our original loaf. But when you consider this was baked with dough that had been in the refrigerator for 3 days and part of it was in for 2 days, so some of that dough was in the refrigerator for a total of 5 days. No extra yeast was added the second time around. I think it came pretty darn good. Well, this really turned out to be a lovely bread. It's very nice, it's tender. Let's give it a taste now. And you know, I'm thinking I'm going to experiment and I'm going to try doing this in a loaf pan. I'm going to try doing a lot of different things with this, maybe making rolls, maybe even try cinnamon rolls with this dough. I think it might turn out quite well. Well, let's give this a taste. Very good. It's tasty. I'm impressed. Well, I look forward to sharing more with you about this Busy Mother sourdough. And if you've been struggling with sourdough starter, I really hope you'll give it a try. I think you're going to be pleasantly surprised. If you want to learn to make more breads, as well as quick breads and muffins and cookies and cakes and crackers, be sure to click on this video over here, where I've curated all of my baking videos into one playlist. And I'll see you over there in my Texas Hill Country Kitchen. Love and God bless.